In a medieval world where every shadow, dream, and bird's flight could foretell fortune or doom, villagers turned to omens and sacred objects to navigate life's uncertainties. From the eerie cries of ravens to the whispered wishes at ancient wells, and from cursed rings to holy relics, these stories reveal a society bound by faith and fear, where the unseen shaped every decision. Step into their world and discover how these ancient practices echo in our modern instincts, drawing you to wonder what signs still guide us today. The evil eye, protective charms, and daily fears. You settle into the dim light of a thatched cottage in a 12th century English village, the air thick with the scent of peat smoke and damp earth. You can almost feel the weight of unseen forces pressing upon the inhabitants. The concept of the evil eye, known across medieval Europe as malocchio in Italy or mauvais pill in France, was not some fleeting fancy, but a pervasive belief woven into the fabric of daily existence. It stemmed from ancient roots, tracing back to Roman and Byzantine influences, where envy or ill will could manifest as a harmful gaze, capable of withering crops, souring milk, or afflicting children with unexplained maladies. In the Middle Ages, this superstition flourished amid the uncertainties of feudal life, where famine, plague, and feudal obligations left little room for rational explanations. People turned to it as a way to make sense of misfortune, attributing sudden losses not to natural causes, but to the malevolent stare of a neighbor or stranger. You might picture yourself as a simple peasant, rising at dawn to tend your plot of land. The soil is heavy clay, clumped and unforgiving under your wooden plow, pulled by an ox whose ribs show through its hide from last year's poor harvest. As you work, you glance warily at passers-by on the rutted path, for any lingering look could invite the evil eye. Historical records from monastic chronicles, such as those penned by Gerald of Wales in his journey through Wales around 1188, describe how villagers avoided direct eye contact during transactions at market fairs, lest jealousy over a bountiful basket of turnips or a healthy piglet trigger a curse. This wasn't mere paranoia. It reflected a worldview where the spiritual and physical realms intertwined seamlessly. The Church, ever pragmatic in blending pagan holdovers with Christian doctrine, tacitly endorsed such beliefs by incorporating prayers against the evil eye into liturgies, as seen in the 10th century Anglo-Saxon Laknanga manuscript, a collection of remedies that mixed herbal lore with incantations. Protective measures were as commonplace as bread on the table. You would have worn an amulet, perhaps a small pouch of herbs like rue or vervain, tied around your neck with a thread spun during a full moon for added potency. These charms were crafted with meticulous care, with its bitter leaves and yellow flowers, was harvested at dawn while reciting verses from Psalms to invoke divine safeguard. In Mediterranean regions, influenced by Islamic and Jewish traditions via trade routes, blue glass beads, shaped like Eisnazar amulets, became popular, their color believed to deflect harmful glances by mimicking the sky's vastness. Archaeological finds from sites like the medieval town of Novgorod in Russia reveal thousands of such beads buried in household refuse, indicating their everyday use. For children, especially vulnerable as they were seen as pure vessels, tainted mothers pinned coral branches or tiny silver handsmano FICO gestures to swaddling cloths, a practice documented in Italian notarial records from the 13th century. But these protections extended beyond personal adornments into the architecture of daily life. You can envision the lintels of doorways etched with faint crosses or hung with horseshoes, not for luck as we think today, but to bar entry to envious spirits. In rural France, as chronicled by the inquisitorial records of the 1320s, farmers painted eyes on barn doors to stare back at potential cursors, a dull but deliberate act repeated generation after generation. The significance lay in the routine: threshing grain while wearing a red ribbon, or spitting 3 times over your shoulder upon receiving a compliment to neutralize hidden malice. These acts, though monotonous, underscored human resilience, a quiet defiance against the caprices of fate in an era when life expectancy hovered around 35 years, and infant mortality claimed half of all births. Yet, amid this web of safeguards, tensions simmered. What if a cow's milk dried up inexplicably, or a child fell ill with fever? Fingers would point, whispers spread through the alehouse or churchyard. But how did communities distinguish between mere bad luck and the deliberate infliction of the evil eye, and what repercussions followed such accusations? As you walk through the muddy lanes of a 12th century village, the fear of the evil eye lingers like a shadow, shaping not just personal habits, but the very rhythm of community life. The belief was more than a private superstition. It was a social force, dictating interactions and fueling suspicions that could fracture fragile bonds. Imagine yourself pausing at the village well, a bucket of cold water sloshing in your hands, as you overhear hushed gossip about a widow whose barren garden is blamed on her neighbor's envious stare. Such accusations, often born from small slights or unexplained misfortunes, were not uncommon, as recorded in the court rolls of English manors like those of Wakefield in the 1270s. These documents detailed disputes where a farmer claimed another's gaze caused a sow to miscarry or a loom to break, petty grievances that escalated into communal strife. The evil eye was a convenient scapegoat in a world where survival hinged on cooperation. Yet envy thrived amid scarcity. The mechanisms to counter the evil eye grew elaborate, blending practicality with ritual. You might join a group of women at the hearth, weaving protective charms under the flickering light of a tallow candle. They'd teach you to not read chords with precise count 7 knots for the 7 virtues to hang above a cradle, a practice noted in the 13th century writings of Dominican friar Albertus Magnus, who catalogued folk remedies alongside theological treatises. In southern Europe, particularly in Italy, midwives performed rituals called fascinatura, using olive oil dripped into water to diagnose the evil eye's presence. If the oil scattered, a curse was confirmed, and countermeasures began. These involved chanting prayers, often in Latin mixed with local dialects, while burning rosemary to cleanse the air. Archaeological evidence from sites like Pompeii's medieval layers shows small bronze bells buried near thresholds, rung to disrupt malevolent forces with their chime. The church played a dual role, both condemning and co-opting these practices. While bishops decried pagan superstitions, Local priests often blessed amulets or sprinkled holy water on fields to ward off curses, as seen in the 11th century penitentials of Burchard of Worms, which list penances for such syncretic acts. This uneasy alliance reflected the Church's need to maintain influence over a populace clinging to older traditions. In Jewish and Muslim communities, integrated into medieval Europe through trade and conquest, the evil eye held similar sway. Sephardic Jews in Spain inscribed protective verses from the Torah on parchment amulets, while Islamic scholars like Al-Ghazali referenced the evil eye in theological texts, suggesting recitations of the Quran Surah Al-Falaq to deflect harm. These cross-cultural exchanges enriched the tapestry of rituals as merchants carried talismans along the Silk Road, blending Persian, Byzantine, and European elements. Yet, the fear of the evil eye could turn neighbor against neighbor. In small communities, where everyone knew each other's fortunes and failures, accusations often targeted the marginalized widows, outsiders, or those with physical differences. The 14th century chronicle of Jean Froissart recounts a Breton village where a woman with a squint was shunned, her crooked gaze blamed for a murrain among cattle. Such suspicions rarely led to formal trials in this era, unlike later witch hunts, but they sowed discord. You might witness a tense confrontation at a market stall, where a merchant refuses to sell to a suspected curser, or see a mother shield her child from an elder's glance. These moments, though mundane, carried weight, as trust eroded under the strain of superstition. But what happened when accusations escalated beyond whispers, and communities sought to purge the evil eye's influence? How did justice or vengeance unfold in these tightly knit villages? As you stand in the flickering glow of a village bonfire, the air heavy with the scent of burning oak and whispered accusations, the fear of the evil eye reaches its climax in the medieval world. In a 12th century hamlet, where every misfortune could be traced to a malevolent glance, the line between suspicion and action was perilously thin. When a cow ceased giving milk or a child lingered in fever, the community's gaze turned to those already on the margins: a widow with too few friends, a stranger passing through, or an old woman whose sharp tongue drew envy. The court rolls of Ramsey Abbey in 1290s England record such a case. A woman named Agnes was accused of cursing a neighbor's barley crop with her stare after a dispute over a shared fence. No trial ensued, but Agnes was ostracized, her cottage avoided, her survival precarious. Such resolutions, informal yet brutal, were common, as communities sought to cleanse themselves of perceived threats without resorting to the church's or Lord's justice, which often dismissed evil eye claims as superstition. Countering the evil eye demanded rituals that felt as vital as planting or reaping. You might join a group of villagers circling a suspected victim's home, chanting prayers from the psalter while scattering salter mineral believed to absorb malice, as noted in the 13th century herbal texts of Hildegard. In Mediterranean regions, priests or local healers performed exorcisms of sorts, splashing holy water mixed with crushed garlic on doorframes, a practice documented in Sicilian ecclesiastical records from the 1320s. These acts, repetitive and unglamorous, were the heartbeat of communal resilience, a collective effort to restore balance when the evil eye disrupted it. In Jewish communities, as seen in the Cairo Geniza documents, Families burned incense and recited the Shema to shield homes, while Islamic households in Al-Andalus hung verses from the Quran on walls, blending faith with folk tradition. These rituals, though tedious, were acts of defiance against a world where misfortune struck without warning. The consequences of the evil eye belief were profound, shaping social dynamics in ways that lingered beyond the Middle Ages. It fostered a culture of caution, where compliments were tempered with phrases like, "God willing to avoid tempting fate," a habit still echoed in modern Mediterranean sayings like, "Inshallah." Yet, it also sowed division, as envy became a weapon and trust a casualty. The fear of the evil eye reinforced hierarchies. Those with wealth or power could deflect accusations, while the vulnerable bore the brunt. By the 14th century, as witch hunts began to rise, the evil eye's legacy fed into broader paranoia. Though its earlier form was less about demonic pacts and more about human frailties like jealousy and fear. Reflecting on this, you might see parallels in today's world, where scapegoating and suspicion still flourish in times of uncertainty. The evil eyes, rituals, knotting cords, wearing amulets, painting protective symbols were ordinary acts that revealed an extraordinary truth. People clung to hope and agency in a world they couldn't fully control. These small, repetitive gestures, though rooted in superstition, were testaments to human endurance. Much like our modern habits of checking locks or avoiding certain numbers, the medieval villagers' world feels distant, yet their need to explain the unexplainable resonates. How did these quiet, superstitious acts shape the larger tapestry of medieval society? And what other beliefs drove their daily lives? Knocking on wood. Origins of warding gestures. You tread through the dense forests of 10th century Scandinavia. The air sharp with pine and the distant howl of a wolf. You sense the weight of unseen forces guiding every step. The practice of knocking on wood, a gesture so familiar today, has its roots in the superstitious heart of medieval Europe, where trees were more than timber, they were sacred conduits to the divine. For the Norse, oaks and ashes were dwelling places of spirits, as recounted in the Eddic poems, where the great ash Yggdrasil connected the cosmos. Touching or striking a tree was a way to invoke these spirits' protection or appease their wrath, a belief that filtered into Christian Europe as pagan traditions merged with new faiths. By the 12th century, this act had spread across the continent, from Germanic villages to Anglo-Saxon hamlets, where people rapped on wooden beams to ward off misfortune after boasting or tempting fate. Picture yourself as a villager in a muddy English settlement, your hands calloused from wielding a scythe. You've just bragged about your barley yield at the alehouse, and now, wary of jinxing your luck, you tap the oak table twice. This wasn't mere habit, it was survival in a world where a single storm could ruin a harvest. Chronicles like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, around 1080, hint at such practices, noting how peasants touched wood during feasts to ensure prosperity, a custom born from earlier Celtic reverence for trees as guardians of sacred groves. The Church, while skeptical, tolerated these acts, as seen in the writings of Bede, who described how converts to Christianity still honored holy trees in quiet rituals. The gesture was practical. Wood was everywhere, in homes, carts, and churches, making it an accessible talisman. The act varied by region. In northern Germany, as recorded in the 11th century annals of Adam of Bremen, people struck wooden idols during droughts to summon rain, believing the sound stirred slumbering deities. In Mediterranean lands, influenced by Roman traditions, olive or fig wood was preferred, tied to myths of Pomona, goddess of orchards. Archaeological finds from Viking-era York reveal wooden amulets carved with runes, clutched or tapped during trade deals to ensure fairness. These objects, often no larger than a thumb, were worn smooth from repeated handling, evidence of their daily significance. For children, the gesture was taught. Early mothers would guide tiny hands to knock on cradle edges to protect against sickness, a practice echoed in the 13th century household manuals of Italian merchants. Knocking on wood wasn't just about averting bad luck. It was a dialogue with the unseen. You might stand in a forest clearing, striking a tree's bark while praying for a safe journey, the sound echoing like a plea to the spirits. The gesture's simplicity belied its weight, a small act of defiance against a world of unpredictable plagues and famines. In a society where life expectancy was short and infant mortality high, such rituals offered a semblance of control. But how did this practice evolve from sacred groves to everyday life? And what tensions arose when Christian doctrine clashed with these ancient rites? You're seated now in a dimly lit church, its wooden beams blackened by years of candle smoke, as a priest drones through a Latin sermon. The year is 1150, and though Christianity dominates, the old habit of knocking on wood persists, a quiet rebellion against the church's push for purity. The gesture's spread from pagan groves to Christian homes was gradual but relentless, driven by trade, migration, and the blending of cultures. As Viking raiders settled in England and Normandy, they brought their reverence for trees, which mingled with Celtic and Germanic traditions. By the 12th century, knocking on wood had become a reflex across Europe, a way to deflect the envy of gods or neighbors after a boast. The 13th century chronicle of Matthew Paris mentions a knight who, after praising his horse's strength, wrapped his wooden shield to avoid jinxing its performance in a tournament. A small but telling detail of the custom's reach, the gesture's mechanics were precise, almost ritualistic. In Northern Europe, you'd knock twice, once to summon the spirit, once to send it away using oak for its strength, as noted in the Icelandic sagas. In southern France, influenced by troubadour culture, people tapped olive wood tables during feasts, believing the tree's biblical associations amplified its power. Archaeological evidence from medieval Lubeck shows wooden doorframes scored with repetitive marks, suggesting habitual knocking to protect homes from misfortune. These acts were taught across generations, as seen in the 14th century writings of Christine de Pizan, who described mothers instructing daughters to tap looms before weaving to ensure strong cloth. The gesture's ubiquity made it a social glue, uniting communities in shared belief. Yet it also sparked friction. The church's stance was ambivalent. While early missionaries like Saint Boniface famously felled sacred oaks to prove Christian supremacy, later clergy grudgingly accepted woodknocking as harmless. The 12th century Decretum of Gratian, a legal text, lists minor penances for pagan acts, like striking trees, but enforcement was lax. In monasteries, monks sometimes knocked on wooden pews before prayers, blending the gesture with Christian humility, as recorded in the annals of Cluny Abbey. Yet, puritanical preachers, like Bernard of Clairvaux, condemned it as idolatry, creating tension in villages where old and new faiths coexisted. In Islamic Spain, where Christian and Muslim communities intermingled, knocks on wood was adapted, with some tapping cedar while reciting prayers, a syncretism noted in the 11th century works of Ibn Abdun. This blending of beliefs strengthened the gesture's hold, but it also invited skepticism. In urban centers like Florence, where trade brought new ideas, some merchants dismissed knocking as peasant folly, yet still tapped their desks during deals. As seen in 13th century guild records, the act's persistence revealed human refusal to abandon hope in a world of scarcity and sudden death. But as the gesture became commonplace, did it lose its sacred weight? Or did it evolve into something more personal, a private pact with fate? Now, imagine yourself in a bustling 14th century market square, the clatter of carts and chatter of traders filling the air. Knocking on wood has woven itself into the pulse of daily life. No longer just a ritual, but a reflex, as instinctive as crossing oneself before a meal. By this time, the gesture had transcended its pagan origins, becoming a shared language across classes and creeds. A baker might tap his wooden counter after boasting of fresh loaves. A noble might knock on a chair before a hunt, as recorded in the household accounts of the Duke of Burgundy in 1370. Its endurance lay in its simplicity. Wood was everywhere, and the act required no priest or purse, making it a democratizing force in a hierarchical world. Yet, its meaning had shifted. Where once it invoked tree spirits, now it was a plea to God or fate, a hedge against hubris. The 14th century poet Geoffrey Chaucer, in his Canterbury Tales, alludes to pilgrims tapping wooden staffs to ensure safe travels, a nod to the gesture's Christian veneer. In Jewish communities, as seen in the responsa of Rabbi Isaac ben Sheshat in Spain, knocking on wood accompanied blessings to avert misfortune. Blending Talmudic caution with local custom, archaeological digs in medieval Prague reveal wooden tokens, smoothed by handling, tucked into merchants' stalls, suggesting the gesture's role in commerce. These small acts, though mundane, were anchors of resilience. In some villages, as noted in the 1320s, Inquisition records of Carcassonne, overzealous clergy accused habitual knockers of heresy, though such charges rarely stuck. The real tension lay in the gesture's secularization by the late Middle Ages. It was less about spirits and more about habit, a cultural tick that persisted despite growing skepticism. The 15th century writings of Florentine scholar Leon Battista Alberti mock it as rustic nonsense, yet even he admitted to tapping his desk during negotiations. This duality, belief and doubt, mirrored a society on the cusp of the Renaissance, where reason began to challenge superstition. Today, you knock on wood without thinking, a vestige of those medieval fears and hopes. The gesture's survival reflects humanity's need for small rituals to face the unknown, much like checking a phone for news or locking a door at night. It reminds you that even in a world of science, we cling to acts that feel protective, however irrational. Their world of spirits and omens shaped a legacy that lingers in our reflexes, a quiet testament to the enduring power of belief. Black cats and crossroads, Animal omens in village life. You wander through the twilight of a 13th century French village, the air thick with the scent of damp hay and wood smoke. You notice a black cat dart across the path ahead, its eyes glinting. In the fading light, in medieval Europe, such a sight could stop you in your tracks, not for its beauty, but for the dread it inspired. Black cats, along with other animals like owls and ravens, were potent omens, woven into the fabric of daily life, where superstition governed decisions as much as necessity. The belief in animal omens, particularly at crossroads, those liminal spaces where paths diverged, was ancient, rooted in Celtic and Germanic folklore, and amplified by the Church's uneasy blend of Christian doctrine with older traditions. Two villagers, a black cat crossing your path at a fork in the road, was no mere coincidence. It was a warning of misfortune, perhaps even a brush with the demonic. Imagine yourself as a peasant. You'd pause, heart quickening, as that cat slunk by, its shadow merging with the dusk. The 12th century bestiary texts, like the Aberdeen Bestiary, described cats, especially black ones, as creatures tied to the devil, their nocturnal habits and silent tread evoking suspicion. This wasn't idle fancy. In a world where crops failed and plagues struck without warning, people sought meaning in the mundane. Chronicles from the period, such as those by Orderic Vitalis in Normandy, a reflex born of fear that the animal was a witch's familiar or a spirit in disguise. Crossroads amplified this dread, seen as thresholds where the veil between worlds thinned. A belief echoed in Anglo-Saxon leech books, prescribing rituals to cleanse such places. Protective measures were immediate and practical. You might carry a sprig of rowan, its red berries believed to repel evil. As noted in the 13th century herbal texts of Roger Bacon, some villagers etched crosses into the dirt at crossroads or sprinkled salt, practices recorded in the ecclesiastical records of Chartres from the 1280s. These acts were as routine as locking a door, a quiet defiance against forces beyond control. In Ireland, influenced by Celtic traditions, people tied ribbons to bushes near crossroads to trap malevolent spirits, a custom mentioned in the annals of Ulster. For children, the fear was instilled. In some regions, like parts of Yorkshire, they were seen as bringers of luck if they entered a home willingly. A belief noted in the 14th century accounts of traveling friars. This duality, omen of doom or fortune, reflected the complexity of medieval thought, where meaning shifted with context. The black cat at the crossroads was a mirror of human anxiety, a small creature carrying the weight of a village's hopes and fears. But how did these beliefs shape daily interactions? And what happened when an omen sparked more than caution? You're now in the heart of a bustling 14th century market, the air alive with the bleat of goats and the haggling of vendors. Yet a hush falls as a black cat slinks past a crossroad stall. The fear of animal omens, especially black cats at crossroads, wasn't just a personal quirk. It shaped village dynamics, turning neighbors into wary watchers. By this time, the belief had deepened, fueled by a mix of folklore and church teachings that cast animals as divine messengers or devil's pawns. The 13th century Golden Legend by Jacobus de Voragine reinforced this, recounting tales of cats as agents of Satan, their dark fur a sign of treachery. This narrative trickled into village life, where a cat's path could spark whispers of witchcraft, especially if misfortune followed. The court records of Toulouse in 1335 describe a woman shunned after her black cat was seen at a crossroads before a barn fire. Her guilt assumed without proof. Protective rituals grew more elaborate. You might see a farmer, after spotting a cat, toss a coin into a well at the village edge. In Germanic regions, people carved wooden charms shaped like cats, burying them at crossroads to trap evil, as evidenced by archaeological finds in medieval Hamburg. These acts were communal, binding villagers in shared defense against the unknown. In Scotland, influenced by Celtic lore, families hung iron nails at crossroads, their metal thought to repel malevolent forces, a custom recorded in the Orkneyinga saga. Women, often tasked with household protection, wove nettle cords to drape over doorways, a ritual described in the 13th century writings of Hildegard of Bingen, who saw nettles as purifying. The church's role was complex. While condemning pagan roots, priests often led prayers at crossroads to sanctify them, as seen in the 1290s liturgical records from Canterbury, where clergy sprinkled holy water to cleanse ominous sites. In Islamic Spain, where Christian and Muslim beliefs mingled, some villagers adopted the practice of reciting the Quran as Surah Yasin while passing crossroads, blending traditions, as noted in the works of Ibn al-Haytham. Yet, these omens also bred division. A black cat's appearance could turn a neighbor into a suspect, especially if they were already marginalized. The 14th century chronicle of Jean Froissart tells of a Breton village where a widow's cat, crossing a path before a child's death, led to her exile, her home abandoned to the elements. This fear wasn't universal. In maritime communities, like those in Brittany, black cats were revered as shipboard guardians, believed to bring fair winds, a belief documented in sailors' logs from the 1300s. This contrast dread in villages, luck at sea shows how context shaped meaning. The black cat at the crossroads remained a potent symbol, reflecting humanity's need to interpret chaos. But what happened when these omens led to accusations? And how did communities balance fear with justice? Picture yourself at the edge of a 14th century village where the crossroads lie shrouded in mist. A place where a black cat's fleeting shadow could unravel lives. The fear of animal omens, particularly black cats, had grown into a force that could fracture communities. When misfortune struck a stillborn calf, a fevered child, a failed crop, the sight of a cat at a crossroads often turned suspicion into action. The 1370s manorial records from Bury St. Edmunds recount a case where a woman named Marjorie Poo's black cat was seen near a crossroads before a neighbor's well soured, faced accusations of witchcraft. Though formal trials were rare in this era, social consequences were swift. Marjorie was barred from communal baking ovens, her livelihood crippled. Such ostracism was a common verdict, a silent sentence, harsher than any courts, as it left the accused to fend alone in a world where community meant survival. Rituals to counter these omens were as vital as daily labor. You might join villagers in a midnight procession, led by a priest, to bless a crossroads with chants and candles, a practice noted in the 1340s records of York Minster. These ceremonies, though repetitive, were acts of collective hope, binding people against unseen threats. In Germanic villages, as archaeological finds from Regensburg show, small stone crosses were erected at path junctions, inscribed with prayers to neutralize omens. In Mediterranean regions, households burned sage or hung bells near doorways to drown out a cat's influence, a custom recorded in 14th century Sicilian notarial documents. These acts, mundane yet meaningful, were humanity's stand against chaos, much like sowing seeds in uncertain soil. The legacy of these beliefs was double-edged. They fostered vigilance, as people avoided crossroads at dusk or carried hazel twigs for protection, a habit mentioned in the 15th century writings of John Merck. Yet they also fueled division, targeting the vulnerable widows, outsiders, or those with quirks like a limp or a sharp tongue. By the late Middle Ages, as witch hunts loomed, the black cat stigma laid groundwork for broader paranoia, though earlier it was more about communal blame than demonic conspiracies. In contrast, coastal communities, like those in Cornwall, saw black cats as talismans of fortune, a belief etched in sailors' logs from the 1390s, highlighting how context shaped meaning. Today, the black cat's shadow lingers in our superstitions, a reminder of a time when a single animal could sway a village's fate. You might pause when a cat crosses your path, a reflex echoing medieval fears. These beliefs reveal humanity's enduring need to find order in the unpredictable. Much like modern rituals of checking weather apps or avoiding cracked pavement, the medieval villager, spitting at a crossroads to ward off evil, wasn't so different from you seeking control in an uncertain world. Their omens shaped a cautious society, and their echoes in our habits ask, what other signs did they read in the world around them, and how do those shape our instincts? Spilled salt, rituals to counter misfortune as you sit at a rough-hewn table in a 13th century English village, the glow of a tallow candle casting shadows on the dirt floor. You reach for a small clay pot of salt, a clumsy nudge, and grains scatter across the tabula mishap that, in medieval Europe, carried the weight of a curse. Spilling salt was no trivial accident. It was a harbinger of misfortune, rooted in ancient beliefs that salt, a precious commodity, held sacred properties. Its scarcity made it a symbol of wealth and purity, revered from Roman times when soldiers were paid in salarium to Christian rituals where it blessed altars. In the Middle Ages, spilling it was seen as an affront to divine order, inviting bad luck or even the devil's attention. As noted in the 12th century writings of Honorius Augustodunensis, who linked salt to spiritual protection, picture yourself as a peasant, your fingers trembling as you stare at the spilled granules, each one a tiny betrayal of your household's fragile prosperity. Salt was costly, often worth more than the grain it seasoned, mined from distant deposits like those in Cheshire or boiled from seawater in coastal France, as detailed in the Doomsday Book of 1086. To waste it was to tempt fate in a world where survival hinged on thrift. Superstition demanded immediate action. You'd toss a pinch of the spilled salt over your left shoulder, a gesture believed to blind the devil lurking there, a practice recorded in the 13th century household manuals of Italian merchants. This wasn't mere folklore. It was a reflex born of a worldview where every act carried cosmic weight, and misfortune could strike without warning. Rituals to counter spilled salt, were as varied as the regions of Europe. In Germanic villages, as described in the 11th century, Annals of Adam of Bremen, people swept spilled salt into a fire to burn away its curse, believing flames purified evil. In Mediterranean lands, influenced by Roman traditions, a drop of wine was sprinkled over the spill, a nod to Libitina, goddess of funerals, to appease death's shadow, as seen in notarial records from 14th century Sicily. Archaeological finds from medieval Novgorod reveals small linen pouches, once holding salt, buried under thresholds to ward off further bad luck. For children, the lesson was stern mothers taught them to handle salt with care, as recounted in oral traditions preserved. In later medieval ballads, the church, ever wary of pagan roots, tolerated these rituals while weaving them into Christian practice. Priests blessed salt for exorcisms, as seen in the 10th century Anglo-Saxon Lacnunga manuscript, which prescribed its use in healing rites. Yet, spilling it remained a potent omen, a small act that could unravel a day's peace. You might glance nervously at your neighbors, wondering if their envy caused the spill, or if your own carelessness invited divine wrath. In a world where famine and plague were ever present, such beliefs offered a way to navigate uncertainty. But how did these rituals shape village life, and what tensions arose when spilled salt sparked more than personal fear? You're now in the bustling heart of a 14th century market, where the clink of coins and the chatter of traders mingle with the faint scent of salt carried on the breeze from a nearby stall. Spilling salt wasn't just a personal mishap. It rippled through the community, turning a careless moment into a shared concern. In medieval Europe, where salt preserved food through harsh winters, its loss was a collective worry, amplifying the superstitions' weight. The 13th century chronicle of Matthew Paris recounts a merchant in London who, after spilling salt at a feast, was shunned by guests until he performed the ritual of tossing a pinch over his shoulder, lest his misfortune spread. Such incidents reveal how deeply this belief shaped social bonds, where a single spill could cast doubt on one's standing. Countering the spill demanded precise rituals, each steeped in local tradition. In northern England, as noted in the 14th century, records of Durham Priory, villagers swept spilled salt onto a cloth and buried it at a crossroads, believing this trapped the curse in the earth. In Italy, influenced by Roman and Christian syncretism, people mixed spilled salt with holy water and sprinkled it on doorsteps, a practice documented in the 1320s ecclesiastical records of Florence. Archaeological evidence from medieval Krakow shows tiny clay vials, once filled with salt and herbs, placed under hearths to neutralize bad luck. These acts were communal, often involving neighbors who'd gather to chant prayers, as seen in the 13th century writings of Caesarius of Heisterbach, who described villagers uniting to cleanse a spill's taint. The church's stance was a delicate balance. While condemning pagan undertones, clergy often incorporated salt into blessings, as seen in the 12th century ritual Romanum, which prescribed its use in baptisms to ward off evil. This duality allowed priests to lead rituals after a spill, such as sprinkling blessed salt on fields, a practice noted in the 1290s Annals of Canterbury. In Jewish communities, as recorded in the Cairo Geniza, salt was scattered during Passover. Preparations to ensure purity, and a spill prompted recitations of protective psalms. In Islamic Spain, influenced by trade with the Mediterranean, some households burned spilled salt with incense, a custom mentioned in the 11th century writings of Ibn Abdan. Yet the fear of spilled salt could sow discord in tight-knit villages. A spill might spark accusations of envy or witchcraft, especially if it preceded misfortune, like a sick child or a failed harvest. The 14th century court rolls of Norwich describe a woman blamed for a neighbor's spoiled ale after a salt spill. Her reputation tarnished despite no evidence. These tensions, though small, eroded trust, particularly among the vulnerable widows or outsiders who were often scapegoated. The rituals, while meant to restore order, sometimes deepened divides, as neighbors watched each other for signs of carelessness or malice. But what happened when these accusations escalated, and how did communities resolve the chaos of a simple spill? Imagine yourself standing in a 14th century village square, the air heavy with the scent of baking bread and the murmur of a crowd gathered around a spilled handful of salt. The superstitions surrounding this act had grown into a force that could unravel lives, as a single spill could ignite fear and fracture trust. When misfortune followed a cow's milk drying up a child's fever, or a storm ruining crops, the spill was often blamed and fingers pointed. The 1360s manorial records of Winchester detail a case where a man named Thomas Hose spilled salt, preceded a neighbor's barren field, was accused of cursing the land. Though no formal trial ensued, Thomas was excluded from communal milling rites, a punishment that left him struggling to feed his family. Such social verdicts, quiet but devastating, were common as communities sought to purge the taint of bad luck. Rituals to counter spills were as essential as daily chores. You might join a group of villagers, led by a local wise woman, tossing spilled salt into a stream to wash away its curse, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of St. Albans. In southern Europe, as recorded in 1370s Venetian notarial documents, families buried salt under hearthstones with a whispered prayer to Saint Anthony, believed to guard against misfortune. Archaeological finds from medieval York reveal small iron charms shaped like keys placed near salt stores to lock away evil. These acts, though repetitive, were acts of resilience, a collective stand against the chaos of an unpredictable world. Much like planting seeds in uncertain soil, the legacy of spilled salt was profound, shaping a culture of caution. People avoided boasting at feasts, fearing a spill might follow, a habit echoed in the 15th century writings of John Merck, who noted villagers' reluctance to praise harvests. The superstitions' reach extended beyond villages' merchants in Bruges, as seen in 14th century guild records, kept salt in locked boxes, treating spills as omens of failed deals. By the late Middle Ages, as rational thought grew, the fear of spilled salt waned but never vanished, laying groundwork for later superstitions about luck and fate. In Jewish and Islamic communities, salt retained its sacred role, used in rituals to purify homes, a practice that persists in modern traditions like throwing salt at weddings today. You might toss salt over your shoulder without a thought, a reflex rooted in those medieval fears. The spilled salt superstition reveals humanity's need to control the uncontrollable, much like modern habits of avoiding black cats or checking locks. The medieval villager sweeping salt into a fire to avert doom, was not so different from you, seeking order in chaos. Their rituals, though born of scarcity and fear, were testaments to endurance, shaping a cautious society that echoes in our own gestures. What other small acts, like those tied to mirrors or herbs, carried such weight in their world? And how do they linger in ours? Broken mirrors. 7 years of bad luck, explained as you step into a dimly lit 13th century manor house, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and damp stone. You catch a glimpse of your reflection in a rare polished bronze mirror, a luxury few could afford. In medieval Europe, mirrors were not mere tools for vanity, but objects of mystique, believed to capture glimpses of the soul or the supernatural. The superstition that breaking a mirror brought 7 years of bad luck had deep roots, tied to Roman beliefs about reflections as portals to the spirit world and Christian fears of desecrating sacred images. In a time when glass was scarce and costly, crafted only in places like Venice or Murano, a broken mirror was no small loss. It was a fracture in the delicate balance between the earthly and divine. As noted in the 12th century writings of Peter Abelard, who linked mirrors to divine contemplation. Imagine yourself as a merchant's wife, carefully polishing the household's prized bronze mirror, its surface cloudy but precious. A slip of the hand, and it falls, cracking against the stone floor. Your heart sinks not just for the cost, but for the omen. The belief, recorded in the 13th century chronicle of Salambin Deotum, held that a shattered mirror disrupted the soul's reflection, inviting 7 years of misfortune, a duration tied to Roman ideas of the body renewing every 7 years. This wasn't mere fancy. In a world where plague could claim a village in weeks, such signs were taken seriously. To counter the curse, you might bury the shards under moonlight, a ritual described in the 14th century household manuals of Florentine guilds, believed to return the broken soul to the earth. Protective measures were meticulous. In Northern Europe, as seen in the 11th century annals of Adam of Bremen, people covered mirrors during storms, fearing lightning might shatter them and unleash chaos. In Mediterranean regions, influenced by Byzantine traditions, mirrors were stored in silk-lined boxes, as archaeological finds from medieval Corinth reveal. These boxes, often inscribed with crosses, were meant to shield the mirror's power. For children, the lesson was clear. Mirrors were to be handled with reverence, as mothers taught, according to oral traditions preserved in later medieval ballads. In Jewish communities, as noted in the Cairo Geniza, mirrors were draped during mourning to avoid trapping the departed soul, a practice that merged with Christian rites. The Church, wary of mirrors, pagan associations, often condemned their use as vain, but tolerated their presence in religious art, where they symbolized divine truth. The 12th century Liber Speculus prescribed prayers to cleanse a broken mirror's curse, blending faith with superstition. A broken mirror could unsettle a household, prompting whispers of divine displeasure or envy from neighbors. You might glance at the shards, wondering if your carelessness invited doom or if someone's malice caused the fall. In a society where survival was precarious, such beliefs offered a framework for understanding chaos. But how did this superstition shape daily life? And what happened when a broken mirror sparked more than fear? You're now in the bustling courtyard of a 14th century Italian town, where the clatter of carts and the chatter of artisans fill the air. And a merchant's apprentice has just shattered a glass mirror, its fragments glinting on the cobblestones. The superstition of broken mirrors had woven itself into the fabric of medieval life, turning a costly accident into a communal concern. The belief that a shattered reflection could doom one for 7 years wasn't just personal, it shaped interactions as neighbors watched for signs of cursed households. The 13th century chronicle of Matthew Paris recounts a London guildmaster who, after breaking a mirror, faced suspicion when his wares spoiled, his misfortune blamed on the omen. Such incidents turned mirrors into objects of both reverence and fear, their rarity amplifying their mystique. Rituals to counter a broken mirror were elaborate and varied. In Northern Europe, as noted in the 14th century records of Durham Priory, people gathered shards and tossed them into running water, believing streams could wash away the curse, a practice rooted in Celtic traditions. In Venice, as documented in 1350s notarial records, merchants buried mirror fragments under churchyard soil, reciting prayers to Saint Lucy, patron of sight, to restore spiritual balance. Archaeological finds from medieval Lubeck reveal small lead amulets etched with crosses placed near mirror storage to ward off accidental breaks. These acts, often communal, bound villagers and townsfolk in shared efforts to defy fate, as seen in the 13th century writings of Caesarius of Heisterbach, who described neighbors chanting psalms to cleanse a home after a mirror shattered. The church's role was ambivalent. While mirrors were used in religious art to symbolize divine clarity, as seen in 12th century cathedral frescoes, clergy like Bernard of Clairvaux condemned their secular use as vain, yet tolerated rituals to counter their breaking. The 1290s liturgical records from York show priests blessing broken shards with holy water to neutralize their curse, blending Christian and folk traditions. In Jewish communities, as recorded in the 14th century responsa of Rabbi Isaac ben Shai, mirrors were covered during illness to protect the sick, and a break prompted recitations of the Shema in Islamic Spain. Influenced by trade with Byzantium, some households burned sage near broken mirrors, a custom noted in the 11th century. Works of Ibn Bdun. Yet, the fear of broken mirrors could spark division. A shattered mirror often led to accusations of sabotage or witchcraft, especially if misfortune followed. The 14th century court rolls of Florence describe a woman blamed for a neighbor's failed harvest after her mirror broke. Her reputation eroded despite no proof. These tensions targeted the vulnerable servants, widows, or outsiders who faced ostracism. The rituals, meant to restore order, sometimes deepened mistrust, as neighbors scrutinized each other for signs of ill intent. But what happened when a broken mirror's curse seemed to manifest? And how did communities navigate the fallout of such a potent omen? Picture yourself in a 14th century village, standing amid the wreckage of a shattered mirror, its shards scattered like stars on the dirt floor, each fragment a silent prophecy of 7 years. Woe! The superstition of broken mirrors had become a force that could unravel lives, as communities saw in these accidents a rupture of spiritual harmony. When misfortune struck a fire, a stillborn child, a barren field, the broken mirror was often the scapegoat. The 1370s manorial records of Salisbury recount a case where a servant, Alice, broke her master's mirror and was blamed when his horse died days later. Though no formal trial ensued, Alice was banished from the household, her livelihood severed in a world where service was survival. Such social punishments, swift and merciless, were common, as villages sought to cleanse the curse's taint. Rituals to counter the omen were as vital as daily labor. You might join neighbors in a moonlit ceremony, burying mirror shards at a crossroads with a whispered prayer to Saint Michael, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of Winchester. In Northern Europe, as archaeological finds from medieval York show, broken mirrors were ground into dust and scattered in fields to return the curse to the earth. In Mediterranean towns, as recorded in 1360s Venetian documents, families burned rosemary near the site of a break, believing its smoke purified the air. These acts, repetitive and unglamorous, were anchors of resilience, a collective defiance against an unpredictable world. Much like sowing seeds in uncertain soil, the legacy of broken mirrors was profound, shaping a culture of caution. People avoided mirrors during illness or grief, fearing a break would trap souls, a habit echoed in the 15th century writings of John Merck. The Superstitions' reach extended to trade merchants in Bruges, as seen in 14th century guild records, refused deals with those who'd broken mirrors, fearing shared misfortune. By the late Middle Ages, as rational thought grew, the fear of broken mirrors faded but never vanished, feeding into broader anxieties about luck and fate. In Jewish and Islamic communities, mirrors retained spiritual weight, covered during rituals to honor the dead, a practice that persists in modern traditions today. You might hesitate before a cracked mirror, a reflex rooted in those medieval fears. The broken mirror superstition reveals humanity's need to find meaning in chaos. Much like modern habits of avoiding ladders or knocking on wood, the medieval villager burying shards to avert doom was not so different from you seeking control in an uncertain world. Their rituals, born of scarcity and fear, were testaments to endurance, shaping a cautious society that echoes in our own. Gestures, the mirror's curse, though faded, reminds us how fragile objects once held power over lives. What other objects, like plants or talismans, carried such weight in their world? And how do they shape our instincts today? Herbal amulets, plants as shields against evil as you walk through a misty 12th century village in the heart of Bavaria, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming herbs. You clutch a small linen pouch tied around your neck, its contents a mix of dried rue and vervain. In medieval Europe, herbal amulets were not mere ornaments, but vital shields against evil, believed to ward off curses, illness, and malevolent spirits. Rooted in ancient Greco-Roman and Celtic traditions, these plant-based talismans were revered for their supposed powers, blending pagan lore with Christian rituals. The 11th century writings of Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess and herbalist, describe plants like rue as divine gifts, capable of repelling the devil's influence when worn or hung in homes. In a world where plague and famine struck without warning, these amulets were as essential as bread or fire. Imagine yourself as a peasant, tending a small garden plot behind your Wattendaub cottage. You carefully harvest sprigs of rosemary under a waxing moon, believing its potency peaks in lunar light, a practice noted in the Anglo-Saxon Laknanga manuscript. This wasn't superstition for show, it was survival. Herbs were costly in time, and labor, grown in small patches or gathered from wild meadows, as recorded in the 13th century agricultural texts of Walter of Henley. To make an amulet, you'd crush dried leaves with a mortar, mix them with salt, and sew them into cloth, reciting prayers to Saint Benedict for protection. These pouches were worn close to the skin, their faint aroma a constant reminder of safety. In a precarious world, rituals varied across regions. In Mediterranean villages, as seen in the 12th century notarial records of Genoa, people tucked basil into amulets to guard against the evil eye, its sharp scent thought to disrupt curses. In Northern Europe, archaeological finds from Viking-era York reveal leather pouches containing yarrow, used to protect travelers. Its feathery leaves believed to bind good fortune. For children, mothers tied tiny herb sachets to cradles, a custom mentioned in the 14th century oral traditions of Brittany to shield infants from night spirits. In Jewish communities, as recorded in the Cairo Geniza, dill was favored for its purifying properties, often paired with verses from the Psalms. The Church, wary of pagan roots, often blessed these amulets to align them with Christian faith. The 10th century benedictional of St. Thelwold includes prayers for consecrating herbs, blending old beliefs with new. Yet, an amulet's power could spark unease. You might glance at your neighbor's pouch, wondering if its herbs were meant to protect or curse. In a society where a single failed harvest could mean starvation, these beliefs offered a sense of control. But how did these herbal amulets shape village dynamics? And what happened when their power was questioned or misused? You're now in the bustling market of a 13th century French town, where the scent of lavender and thyme wafts from stalls, and a woman tucks a fresh herbal amulet into her cloak before bargaining for grain. The use of these plant-based talismans wasn't just personal, it wove communities together, yet also sowed suspicion. In medieval Europe, herbal amulets were a shared language of protection, but their power depended on trust in the maker and the herb's origins. The 13th century Chronicle of Selembine, the Adam recounts a village where a healer's rue-filled amulet was blamed for a neighbor's sick cow, sparking whispers of witchcraft. Such incidents show how amulets, meant to shield, could become lightning rods for fear in a world quick to find fault. Crafting these amulets was a meticulous art. In Northern Europe, as noted in the 14th century records of St. Albans, villagers gathered mugwort at dawn, believing its potency warded off spirits when sewn into linen with a cross-stitched prayer. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 1320s Venetian notarial records, basil and fennel were crushed with olive oil, their paste stuffed into pouches, hung above doorways to block curses. Archaeological finds from medieval Krakow reveal clay amulets filled with dried sage, buried under hearths to safeguard homes. These rituals, often communal, involved neighbors chanting or blessing the herbs, as described in the 12th century writings of John of Salisbury, who noted their role in uniting villages against unseen threats. The Church played a dual role. While condemning pagan herbalism, clergy often sanctified amulets, as seen in the 11th century ritual Romanum, which included blessings for plants used in sacred rites. Priests might sprinkle holy water on amulets, a practice recorded in the 1290s Annals of Canterbury, aligning them with Christian faith in Jewish communities, as noted in the 13th century responsa of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. Dill and coriander were paired with Torah verses for protection. In Islamic Spain, influenced by trade, amulets with rosemary and myrrh were burned during prayers, a custom mentioned in the 12th century works of Ibn al-Haytham. These cross-cultural practices enriched the tradition, as merchants carried herbal lore along trade routes. Yet, amulets could breed discord. A poorly made pouch or a healer's failure to avert misfortune often led to accusations of malice. The 14th century court rolls of Norwich describe a woman shunned after her vervain amulet failed to save a child. Her intent questioned despite her efforts. Such tensions targeted the vulnerable herbalists, often women, or outsiders whose knowledge made them both revered and suspect. The rituals, meant to foster safety, sometimes deepened mistrust as villagers scrutinized each other's pouches for signs of harm. But what happened when an amulet's failure led to open conflict? And how did communities resolve the tension between faith and fear? Picture yourself in a 14th century village, standing by a flickering hearth where a healer's herbal amulet stuffed with rue and sage. The superstition surrounding these talismans had grown into a force that could both unite and divide, as their success or failure shaped lives. When an amulet didn't deliver, crop withered. A journey ended in law. Suspicion often fell on the maker. The 1360s manorial records of Bury St. Edmunds recount a case where a woman named Edith, whose lavender amulet failed to protect a neighbor's livestock, was accused of cursing the herd. Though no trial followed, Edith was barred from the village market. Her isolation a harsh penalty in a world where community was survival. Such outcomes were common, as amulets carried the weight of hope and blame. Rituals to reinforce or salvage. Amulets were as vital as sowing fields. You might join villagers in a dawn ceremony, burning failed amulets in a fire with prayers to Saint Hildegard, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of York Minster. In Mediterranean towns, as recorded in 1370s Sicilian documents, families buried ineffective pouches under church steps, believing sacred ground neutralized their failure. Archaeological finds from medieval Prague show herb-filled amulets, wreathed with new plants, tucked into rafters to restore their power. These acts, repetitive yet profound, were acts of resilience, a collective stand against a world of sudden plagues and famines, much like mending a torn net to catch fish. The legacy of herbal amulets was enduring, shaping a culture of caution and care. People grew herbs with precision, avoiding harvest on certain days, as noted in the 15th century writings of John Merck, who described villagers' fear of angering plant spirits. The superstitions' reach extended to trade merchants in Florence, as seen in 14th century guild records, carried amulets to ensure safe deals, blaming failures on faulty herbs. By the late Middle Ages, as herbalism blended with early science, amulets faded but left traces in apothecary traditions. In Jewish and Islamic communities, herbs, like myrrh, remained sacred, used in rituals that persist in modern blessings. Today, you might carry a sachet of lavender or plant rosemary for luck, echoes of those medieval amulets. The belief in their power reveals humanity's need to harness nature against the unknown, much like modern habits of wearing lucky charms or planting protective shrubs. The medieval villager sewing a pouch under moonlight was not so different from you, seeking safety in uncertainty. Their rituals, born of fear and hope, shaped a society that trusted in nature's power, a legacy that lingers in our gardens and gestures. What other beliefs, like those tied to stars or wells, carried such weight in their world? And how do they echo in ours? Astrology's grip, stars guiding medieval decisions. You stand beneath the vast, star-strewn sky of a 12th century English village. The air crisp and the Milky Way, a faint shimmer above. You feel the weight of the heavens guiding your every choice. In medieval Europe, astrology was no mere curiosity, was a science, a divine map believed to shape destinies from kings to peasants. Rooted in Greco-Roman traditions and enriched by Islamic scholars like al-Biruni, whose works reached Europe. Via Spain, the stars were seen as God's script, dictating everything from planting crops to waging wars. The 11th century writings of Adelard of Bath, an English scholar, describe how villagers consulted star charts before sowing, convinced that celestial alignments influenced harvests. In a world where survival hung on unpredictable seasons, astrology offered a semblance of control. Picture yourself as a farmer, squinting at the night sky, tracing the path of Venus with a calloused finger. You'd seek the advice of a local cleric or wise woman who might unroll a parchment marked with zodiac signs, as described in the 12th century astronomical texts of Roger of Hereford. These weren't idle predictions, they were practical. Planting under Taurus, a fertile earth sign, was thought to ensure bountiful crops, while Aries favored bold ventures like travel. Manuscripts like the 13th century Liber Astronomia detail how peasants timed shearing or breeding livestock. 2 lunar phases, believing the moon's waxing strengthened outcomes. Even childbirth was planned, when possible, under favorable constellations, a practice noted in the medical texts of Trotula of Salerno. Astrological tools were simple but revered. You might carry a small wax tablet etched with planetary positions, updated by a traveling astrologer, as archaeological finds from medieval York reveal. In wealthier households, bronze astrolabes, like those crafted in 12th century Toledo, measured star angles with precision, blending Islamic and Christian knowledge. For the poor, oral traditions sufficed. Elders taught children to watch for Orion's rise to signal harvest time, as recorded in the 14th century oral ballads of Brittany. In Jewish communities, as seen in the Cairo Genisa astrological charts, guided marriage dates, aligning with favorable stars to ensure harmony. The Church, wary of divination's pagan roots, grudgingly accepted astrology as a divine tool. The 12th century Decretum of Gratian allowed its use for practical matters, like agriculture, though it condemned predicting individual fates. Yet even monks consulted stars for monastery schedules, as noted in the annals of Cluny Abbey's. Grip was universal, crossing class and creed, but it wasn't without risk. You might hesitate before planting, wondering if a misread star could doom your crop, or if a neighbor's success under a different sign hinted at hidden knowledge. In a society where famine was a constant threat, the stars were both guide and judge. But how did this reliance on the heavens shape daily life? And what tensions arose when the stars seemed to fail? You're now in the heart of a 13th century Italian town, where a crowd gathers around a traveling astrologer, unrolling a star chart in the market square. Its ink smudged from constant use, astrology's influence had deepened, shaping not just personal decisions, but entire communities, as the stars dictated everything from trade deals to marriage contracts. The 13th century chronicle of Matthew Paris recounts a merchant who delayed a sea voyage until Jupiter aligned with Pisces, fearing storms under a misaligned sky. This reliance on celestial guidance wasn't mere superstition, it was a framework for navigating a world where a single failed venture could mean ruin, and astrology's blend of science and faith made it a trusted tool. Consulting the stars was a communal affair. In Northern Europe, as noted in the 14th century records of Durham Priory, villagers gathered at twilight to hear a cleric interpret the zodiac, deciding when to plant or slaughter livestock. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 1320s Venetian notarial records, merchants paid for detailed horoscopes before signing contracts, believing Saturn's position could sway profits. Archaeological finds from medieval Prague reveal wax tablets etched with star positions used by local healers to time herbal remedies. These practices, often led by learned figures, bound communities in shared rituals, as described in the 12th century writings of John of Salisbury, who noted astrology's role in uniting villages under a common cosmic order. The Church's stance remained complex, while figures like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century argued that stars influenced earthly events under God's will. Others, like Bernard of Clairvaux, warned against over-reliance, fearing it bordered on heresy. Yet, monasteries often employed astrologers, as seen in the 1290s Annals of Canterbury, where monks charted stars to schedule feast days. In Jewish communities, as recorded in the 13th century responsa of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, astrological tables guided religious festivals, aligning them with favorable signs. In Islamic Spain, influenced by scholars like Ibn Rushd, astrology shaped medical diagnoses, with doctors timing treatments to lunar cycles, a practice noted in 12th century medical texts. But astrology's grip could spark conflict when predictions felled a crop withered. Despite a favorable sign, blame often fell on the astrologer or neighbors suspected of sabotaging the reading. The 14th century court rolls of Florence describe a healer accused of misreading stars, causing a failed harvest, her reputation ruined despite her protests. Such tensions often targeted the vulnerable women, outsiders, or those with esoteric knowledge who faced suspicion when the heavens didn't deliver. The rituals, meant to bring order, sometimes deepened mistrust as communities grappled with the stars' unpredictability. But what happened when astrology's failures led to open disputes? And how did society balance faith in the stars with the reality of earthly chaos? Imagine yourself in a 14th century village square, the night sky ablaze with stars, as a crowd murmurs over a failed harvest blamed on a misread constellation. Astrology's hold had become a double-edged sword, guiding lives but also igniting disputes when its predictions faltered, when the stars seemed to betray a drought struck, despite Taurus' promise, or a child born under Virgo fell ill communities turned on those who read the heavens. The 1360s manorial records of Salisbury recount a cleric, Brother William, accused of falsifying a star chart after a village's barley crop failed. His banishment from the parish, a stark reminder of astrology's high stakes. Such social verdicts, swift and severe, were common, as the star's failure demanded scapegoats in a world where survival was precarious. Rituals to appease the heavens were as vital as tilling soil. You might join villagers in a midnight vigil led by a priest offering candles to align the star's favor, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of York Minster. In Mediterranean towns, as recorded in 1370s Venetian documents, merchants burned incense under a waxing moon to correct a misaligned horoscope. Archaeological finds from medieval Regensburg show clay tablets inscribed with zodiac signs, buried at field edges to restore celestial harmony. These acts, repetitive yet profound, were acts of resilience, a collective stand against a cosmos that seemed capricious, much like mending a broken plow to ensure a harvest. Astrology's legacy was profound, shaping a culture of cosmic caution. People planned lives around planetary cycles, avoiding travel under Scorpio's sway. As noted in the 15th century writings of John Merck, its influence reached trade merchants in Bruges, as seen in 14th century guild records, consulted astrologers before voyages, blaming losses on errant stars. By the late Middle Ages, as science like Copernicus' heliocentrism emerged, astrology's grip loosened but never faded, leaving traces in almanacs and calendars. In Jewish and Islamic communities, star charts guided rituals, a tradition persisting. In modern horoscopes, today you might glance at a zodiac app, a reflex echoing those medieval stargazers. Astrology's hold reveals humanity's need to find order in chaos. Much like modern habits of checking forecasts or lucky numbers, the medieval villager, charting stars to plant or marry, was not so different from you, seeking certainty in an uncertain world. Their rituals, born of hope and fear, shaped a society that looked to the heavens for answers, a legacy that lingers in our curiosity about the stars. What other signs, like birds or wells, guided their choices, and how do they echo in our instincts today? Bird auguries, reading signs from the skies as you stand in a dew-soaked meadow at dawn in a 12th century Scottish village, the air sharp with the scent of heather. You watch a flock of ravens wheel overhead, their cries piercing the quiet. In medieval Europe, birds were not just creatures of the wild, but divine messengers, their flights and behaviors read as omens of fortune or doom. This practice of augury, rooted in Roman and Celtic traditions, held that the skies carried God's will, with birds as its interpreters. The 11th century writings of Gerald of Wales describe how villagers studied sparrows, chatter, or crows, paths to predict harvests or warn of invasions. In a world where a single storm could ruin a crop, bird auguries offered a way to navigate uncertainty, blending observation with faith. Picture yourself as a farmer, pausing your work to note a hawk circling above your barley field. Its direction left or right could mean prosperity or blight. As detailed in the 12th century De Ornithomantia, a text on bird divination, a single crow landing near your home was a warning of death. while two promised harmony, beliefs, recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. These weren't idle fancies, they shaped daily decisions. Before a journey, you might wait for a swallow's flight to signal safe passage, a custom noted in the 13th century travel accounts of Marco Polo, who observed similar practices in Europe's fringes. Even planting was timed to birds' migrations, with larks' spring arrivals signaling the season's start. Augury rituals were precise. In Northern Europe, as archaeological finds from Viking-era York show, villagers carved wooden bird figures to place on rooftops, believing they drew favorable omens. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 12th century Sicilian notarial records, people scattered grain to attract doves, their cooing interpreted as divine approval. For children, elders taught the art of watching birds, as oral traditions preserved in 14th century Breton ballads attest. In Jewish communities, as noted in the Cairo Geniza, sparrows were seen as signs of God's mercy, their presence guiding prayer times. The church, wary of pagan divination, often reframed augury as reading God's signs. The 12th century decree of Gratian permitted observing birds for practical purposes, like weather prediction, but condemned personal fortune-telling. Yet, monks themselves noted bird movements, as seen in the annals of Cluny Abbey, to schedule planting. Bird auguries crossed class and creed, but they carried risks. You might hesitate before sowing, fearing a raven's cry signaled ruin, or wonder if a neighbor's success meant they read the skies better. In a society where famine loomed, birds were both guides and judges. But how did these omens shape village life, and what tensions arose when their signs went unheeded? You're now in the bustling heart of a 13th century German market, where a merchant pauses his trade to watch a flock of starlings swirl above, their pattern a clue to his next deal's success. Bird auguries had woven themselves into the fabric of medieval life, guiding not just farmers, but traders, healers, and lords. The 13th century chronicle of Salembin Diadem recounts a knight who delayed a tournament after seeing an owl at dusk, fearing it foretold defeat. This reliance on avian signs wasn't mere whimsy, it was a communal practice, shaping decisions from marriage to warfare. In a world where uncertainty ruled, the skies were a shared text, read by all, but their interpretation could spark unity or discord. Reading birds was a meticulous craft. In Northern Europe, as noted in the 14th century records of St. Albans, villagers gathered at dawn to observe rooks' flights, believing a westward path signaled rain, guiding planting schedules. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 1320s Venetian notarial records, sailors watched gulls before voyages, their low flight warning of storms. Archaeological finds from medieval Krakow reveal bone carvings of birds, used by healers to predict recovery, their shapes mimicking observed species. These rituals, often led by wise women or clerics, bound communities, as described in the 12th century writings of John of Salisbury, who noted how auguries fostered collective hope against nature's caprices. The church's stance was delicate. While condemning pagan divination, clergy often interpreted birds as divine signs, as seen in the 11th century Physiologus, which cast doves as symbols of the Holy Spirit. Priests might lead prayers after a grim omen, like a raven's cry, a practice recorded in the 1290s Annals of Canterbury. In Jewish communities, As noted in the 13th century responsa of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, sparrows' nests near homes signaled blessings, guiding festival dates. In Islamic Spain, influenced by scholars like Ibn Rushd, falcons' flights were read before battles, a custom mentioned in 12th century military texts. These cross-cultural practices enriched augury as trade routes carried bird lore across borders. Yet auguries could breed conflict. When omens failed, a harvest rotted despite a dove's promise. Blame often fell on the interpreter. The 14th century court rolls of Norwich describe a wise woman shunned after her crow-based prediction failed, her advice blamed for a village's hunger. Such tensions targeted the vulnerable elders, women, or outsiders whose readings were questioned when misfortune struck. The rituals, meant to unify, sometimes deepened mistrust as villagers debated whose augury was true. But what happened when bird signs led to open disputes? And how did communities navigate the fallout of a misread sky? Picture yourself in a 14th century village, standing in a windswept field as a lone crow circles above, its harsh cry blamed for a recent flood that ruined the harvest. Bird auguries had become a force that could fracture communities as failed omens turned hope into accusation. When signs misled a flock of sparrows promised rain, but drought followed, villagers often targeted those who read the skies. The 1360s manorial records of Winchester recount a case where a healer, Agnes, was ostracized after her dove-based prediction failed, her village blaming her for a barren season. Such social punishments, swift and severe, were common as communities sought to purge the taint of a misread omen in a world where survival was fragile. Rituals to counter bad auguries were as vital as reaping crops. You might join villagers in a twilight ceremony, scattering grain to draw favorable birds, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of York Minster. In Mediterranean towns, as recorded in 1370s Sicilian documents, families burned feathers from an ill-omened bird, like an owl, to cleanse its curse. Archaeological finds from medieval Regensburg show wooden bird effigies buried at field edges to redirect bad omens. These acts, repetitive yet profound, were acts of resilience, a collective stand against a sky that seemed to betray, much like repairing a dam after a flood. The legacy of bird auguries was enduring, shaping a culture of vigilance. People watched skies with care, avoiding travel after a raven's cry. As noted in the 15th century writings of John Merck, the practice reached trade merchants in Venice. As seen in 14th century guild records, delayed shipments based on goal patterns, blaming losses on ignored signs. By the late Middle Ages, as science began to challenge superstition, auguries faded but left traces in weather lore and proverbs. In Jewish and Islamic communities, birds like doves remained symbols of divine will, a tradition persisting in modern rituals taught today. You might pause at a bird's call, a reflex echoing those medieval skies. Bird auguries reveal humanity's need to find meaning in the unpredictable, much like modern habits of checking weather apps or heeding old sayings. The medieval villager, reading a hawk's flight to plant or travel, was not so different from you seeking order in chaos. Their rituals, born of hope and fear, shaped a society that looked to the skies for answers, a legacy that lingers in our fascination with nature's signs. What other omens like curses or wells, guided their lives, and how do they echo in our instincts today? Wishing wells, sacred springs, and superstitions. As you kneel beside a moss-covered well in a 12th century Welsh village, the air cool with the scent of wet stone and wild mint, you drop a pebble into the dark water, whispering a hope for a good harvest. In medieval Europe, wishing wells were not mere sources of water, but sacred sites, believed to house spirits or divine powers that could grant wishes or curse the careless. Rooted in Celtic and pre-Christian traditions, these springs were seen as thresholds to the divine, their waters carrying prayers to gods or saints. The 11th century writings of Gerald of Wales describe villagers offering coins or cloth to wells to ensure health or fertility, a practice blending pagan reverence with Christian blessings. In a world where drought could starve a community, wells were both lifeline and oracle. Picture yourself as a villager, drawing water at dawn, careful not to disturb the well's spirit. You'd toss in a bent pin or a sprig of hazel, believing it secured the water's favor. As noted in the 12th century Anglo-Saxon leech book, this wasn't idle ritual. Water was life, and wells were scarce, often shared by entire villages, as recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086. A wish made at a well-wether for a safe birth or a bountiful crop was a pact with the unseen, sealed with offerings there were suggesting frequent use. Rituals varied by region. In Ireland, as seen in the Annals of Ulster, people tied ribbons to trees near wells to bind their wishes, a Celtic custom persisting into Christian times. In Mediterranean regions, as noted in 12th century Sicilian records, villagers poured wine into wells to appease their spirits, a nod to Roman libations. For children, elders taught reverence for wells, warning against spitting into them, as oral traditions in 13th century Breton ballads attest. In Jewish communities, as recorded in the Cairo Genessa, wells were blessed with psalms to ensure purity, their waters used in rituals. The church, wary of pagan roots, often rededicated wells to saints, like Saint Brigid in Ireland, as seen in the 10th century Vita Sanctae Brigidae. Clergy blessed wells to align them with Christian faith, yet tolerated offerings as acts of devotion. A wish at a well could spark hope, but also unease you. Might wonder if a neighbor's offering outshone yours, or if a failed wish signaled divine displeasure. In a society where water meant survival, wells held immense power. But how did these sacred springs shape daily life, and what tensions arose when their promises went unfulfilled? You're now in the heart of a 13th century French village, where a crowd gathers around a stone-lined well, its surface rippling with tossed pebbles, as a woman whispers a wish for her child's health. Wishing wells were more than sacred sites, they were communal hubs, where hopes and fears were shared, but also where suspicion could fester. The 13th century chronicle of Selembin de Adam recounts a village where a failed well-wish followed by a child's death led to whispers that a neighbor's curse tainted the water. Such incidents reveal how wells, meant to unify, could become flashpoints for blame in a world where survival depended on trust and water's purity. Offerings at wells were a meticulous craft. In Northern Europe, as noted in the 14th century records of Durham Priory, villagers dropped silver pins into wells at dawn, believing the metal pleased the spirits. ensuring clean water. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 1320s Venetian notarial records, people offered olive oil, its sheen thought to carry prayers to the divine. Archaeological finds from medieval Krakow show clay tokens etched with spirals sunk into wells to secure blessings. These rituals, often communal, involved chanting or prayers, as described in the 12th century writings of John of Salisbury, who noted how wells bound communities in shared hopes against drought or disease. The Church's role was complex. While condemning pagan offerings, clergy often blessed wells, as seen in the 11th century ritual Romanum, which included prayers to sanctify springs. Priests might lead processions to wells, sprinkling holy water, a practice recorded in the 1290s Annals of Canterbury. In Jewish communities, as noted in the 13th century responsa of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, well water was used in purification rites, with offerings of bread to ensure its sanctity. In Islamic Spain, influenced by trade, some poured rosewater into wells, a custom mentioned in the 12th century works of Ibn al-Haytham, blending local and foreign traditions. Yet, wells could spark division. A failed wish-a-barren field, despite a coin's offering, often led to accusations of sabotage or witchcraft. The 14th century court rolls of Norwich describe a woman shunned after her well-wish preceded a neighbor's sick livestock, her intent questioned despite no proof. Such tensions targeted the vulnerable widows, healers, or outsiders whose offerings were scrutinized when misfortune struck. The rituals, meant to foster hope, sometimes deepened mistrust, as villagers debated whose wish angered the well's spirit. But what happened when a well's failure led to open conflict, and how did communities resolve the chaos of an unfulfilled wish? Picture yourself in a 14th century village, standing by a well now clouded with silt, its failure to grant a wish for rain blamed for a parched harvest. Wishing wells had become more than sacred springs. They were forces that could fracture communities when their promises faltered. When a wish failed, a child remained ill, a crop withered, villagers often turned on those who made offerings, suspecting malice or a tainted gift. The 1360s manorial records of Winchester recount a case where a woman, Margaret, was accused of cursing a well after her tossed coin preceded a neighbor's fevered infant. Though no trial ensued, Margaret was barred from drawing water. Her isolation, a harsh penalty in a world where wells were lifeblood. Rituals to restore a well's favor were as vital as planting crops. You might join a midnight procession, led by a priest pouring blessed water into the well to cleanse its spirit, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of York Minster. In Mediterranean towns, as recorded in 1370s Sicilian documents, families buried failed offerings, like spoiled bread, under sacred trees to appease the well's guardian. Archaeological finds from medieval Regensburg show stone carvings etched with prayers sunk into wells to renew their power. These acts, repetitive yet profound, were acts of resilience, a collective stand against a world of drought and disease. Much like rebuilding a dam after a flood, the legacy of wishing wells was enduring, shaping a culture of cautious hope. People made offerings with care, avoiding certain days, as noted in the 15th century writings of John Merck, who described villagers' fear of angering well spirits. The practice reached trade merchants in Bruges, as seen in 14th century guild records, tossed coins into wells before voyages, blaming losses on neglected rituals. By the late Middle Ages, as science questioned superstition, well-wishing faded, but left traces in folklore and festivals. In Jewish and Islamic communities, wells remained sacred, their waters used in blessings, a tradition persisting in modern rituals. Today, you might toss a coin into a fountain, a reflex echoing those medieval well-wishers. The wishing well reveals humanity's need to seek favor from the unknown, much like modern habits of crossing fingers or planting lucky herbs. The medieval villager, offering a pebble for a bountiful harvest, was not so different from you seeking hope in uncertainty. Their rituals, born of necessity and faith, shaped a society that trusted in water's power, a legacy that lingers in our gestures and stories. What other practices, like curses or talismans, guided their lives, and how do they echo in our instincts today? Cursed objects, the fear of tainted possessions. As you sit by a flickering hearth in a 13th century English village, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs, you eye a tarnished silver ring on the table, its origin unknown. In medieval Europe, certain objects, rings, tools, or even clothing were feared as cursed, believed to carry malevolent forces that could bring ruin to their owners. Rooted in Germanic and Celtic folklore, these beliefs held that objects could be imbued with ill intent through witchcraft or divine wrath. The 12th century writings of John of Salisbury describe villagers shunning a stranger's cloak, fearing it was hexed after its wearer fell ill. In a world where misfortune struck without warning, such objects were seen as conduits of chaos, demanding caution. Picture yourself as a blacksmith, gifted an old hammer by a traveler. Its odd weight and worn handle make you pause. Could it carry a curse? The fear wasn't baseless. Objects were often tied to their owners' fates. The 13th century chronicle of Matthew Paris recounts a knight who blamed a gifted dagger for his horse's death, claiming it was cursed by a rival. These beliefs shaped daily life. You'd avoid touching unknown items, fearing they held spirits or spells. To counter a potential curse, you might wrap the object in rowan bark, believed to repel evil, as noted in the 12th century herbal texts of Roger Bacon, or leave it at a crossroads, a practice recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Leech Book. Rituals to cleanse cursed objects were widespread. In Northern Europe, as archaeological finds from Viking-era York show, suspect items were buried under hearthstones to neutralize their power. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 12th century Sicilian records, people dipped objects in holy water, blessed by Saint Agatha, believed to break curses. For children, elders taught caution around strangers' gifts, as oral traditions in 13th century Breton ballads warn. In Jewish communities, as noted in the Cairo Geniza, suspect objects were purified with prayers from the Book of Numbers, aligning them with sacred rites. The Church, wary of pagan superstitions, often reframed these fears as tests of faith. The 11th century benedictional of Saint Thelwold includes prayers to bless suspect objects, turning them into Christian talismans. Yet, the fear of curses persisted, sparking unease. You might glance at the ring, wondering if its last owner's misfortune now stalked you, or if a neighbor's envy planted it in your home. In a society where a single loss could mean ruin, cursed objects were both threat and mystery. But how did these fears shape village interactions? And what happened when a cursed object sparked more than suspicion? You're now in the bustling market of a 14th century Italian town, where a trader hesitates to touch a tarnished brooch, fearing it carries a curse after its seller fell ill. The belief in cursed objects had woven itself into medieval life, turning everyday items into potential threats that shaped community dynamics. The 13th century Chronicle of Salembin de Autumn recounts a village where a gifted cloak blamed for a family's sickness led to whispers of witchcraft against its giver. Such fears weren't just personal, they rippled through villages. As neighbors watched for signs of tainted possessions, suspecting malice in every misfortune. In a world where trust was fragile, a cursed object could unravel social bonds. Cleansing rituals were a communal effort. In Northern Europe, as noted in the 14th century records of St. Albans, villagers buried suspect items, like knives, under churchyard soil, believing sacred ground neutralized curses. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 1320s Venetian notarial records, people burned sage around questionable objects, its smoke thought to dispel evil. Archaeological finds from medieval Krakow reveal iron nails driven into suspect tools, a ritual to pin the curse, as described in the 12th century writings of John of Salisbury, who noted how such acts united communities against unseen threats. The Church's role was ambivalent. While condemning pagan fears, clergy often blessed suspect objects, as seen in the 11th century ritual Romanum, which included prayers to purify items. Priests might sprinkle holy water on a cursed ring, a practice recorded in the 1290s Annals of Canterbury, aligning it with Christian faith. In Jewish communities, as noted in the 13th century responsa of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, suspect objects were wrapped in cloth inscribed with Torah verses for protection. In Islamic Spain, influenced by trade, some burned myrrh near tainted items, a custom mentioned in the 12th century works of Ibn al-Haytham, blending local and foreign traditions. Yet the fear of cursed objects could spark division. A string of misfortunes, a barren field, a sick child, often led to accusations that a neighbor's gift was hexed. The 14th century court rolls of Florence describe a woman shunned after her loaned comb preceded a neighbor's fever. Her intent? Questioned despite no evidence. Such tensions targeted the vulnerable travelers, widows, or healers whose possessions were scrutinized when calamity struck. The rituals, meant to restore order, sometimes deepened mistrust as villagers debated whose object carried the curse. But what happened when a cursed object's taint led to open conflict, and how did communities navigate the fallout of such fears? Picture yourself in a 14th century village, standing by a market stall where a tarnished goblet, blamed for a merchant's ruin, lies discarded, its curse feared by all who pass. The belief in cursed objects had grown into a force that could fracture communities, as tainted possessions turned neighbors into suspects. When misfortune followed a fire, a failed crop, a sudden death, the object was often blamed, and its owner accused of malice. The 1360s manorial records of Salisbury recount a case where a man, Thomas, was ostracized after his gifted belt preceded a neighbor's barren field. his banishment from communal feasts, a harsh penalty in a world where social bonds meant survival. Rituals to cleanse cursed objects were as vital as sowing seeds. You might join villagers in a midnight vigil, burying a suspect ring under a church's threshold with prayers to Saint Benedict, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of York Minster. In Mediterranean towns, as recorded in 1370s Venetian documents, families burned rosemary near tainted items, believing its smoke lifted curses. Archaeological finds from medieval Prague show suspect tools wrapped in linen and sunk in rivers to wash away their taint. These acts, repetitive yet profound, were acts of resilience, a collective stand against a world of unseen threats. Much like mending a fence after a storm, the legacy of cursed objects was enduring, shaping a culture of caution. People avoided accepting gifts from strangers, fearing hidden curses. As noted in the 15th century writings of John Merck, the belief reached trade merchants in Bruges. As seen in 14th century guild records, refused items from unlucky owners, blaming losses on tainted goods. By the late Middle Ages, as rational thought grew, fear of cursed objects waned but left traces in folklore and proverbs. In Jewish and Islamic communities, suspect items were purified with sacred texts, a tradition persisting in modern blessings. Today, you might hesitate before taking an heirloom, a reflex echoing those medieval fears. The belief in cursed objects reveals humanity's need to explain the inexplicable, much like modern habits of avoiding unlucky numbers or charms. The medieval villager burying a hexed ring to avert doom was not so different from you seeking control in uncertainty. Their rituals, born of fear and hope, shaped a society wary of the unknown, a legacy that lingers in our hesitations and stories. What other fears, like those of dreams or shadows, guided their lives, and how do they echo in our instincts today? Dream omens, visions in the night, as prophecies as you lie on a straw pallet in a 13th century French village. The air heavy with the scent of damp thatch and cooling embers. A vivid dream of a white stag fleeing a storm stirs you awake, heart pounding. In medieval Europe, dreams were not mere fancies, but potent omens, believed to carry divine or demonic messages about the future. Rooted in Greco-Roman oniromancy and enriched by Christian mysticism, dreams were seen as windows to the soul's fate or God's will. The 12th century writings of Hildegard of Bingen describe dreams as divine visions, guiding everything from personal choices to communal decisions. In a world where uncertainty ruled, dreams offered glimpses of destiny, demanding careful interpretation. Picture yourself as a weaver, recounting your dream to a village elder, hoping to decipher its meaning. A falling star might foretell loss, while a blooming tree promised prosperity. As detailed in the 13th century Somniel Danieli's A Dream Interpretation Manual, these weren't idle musings. Dreams shaped actions a merchant might delay, a journey after dreaming of rough seas, a practice noted in the 12th century travel accounts of Gerald of Wales. Even daily tasks, like sowing crops, were timed to dreams of rain or sun, believed to reflect divine favor. The stakes were high. Misreading a dream could invite disaster in a society where survival was fragile. Dream rituals were precise. In Northern Europe, as archaeological finds from medieval York show, People placed lavender under pillows to invite prophetic dreams, a custom rooted in Celtic lore. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 12th century Sicilian records, villagers fasted before sleep to purify visions, a practice tied to Roman traditions. For children, mothers taught dreams at dawn, as oral traditions in 13th century Breton ballads attest. In Jewish communities, as noted in the Cairo Geniza, dreams were recounted with psalms to discern their truth, aligning them with sacred rites. The Church, wary of pagan roots, framed dreams as divine messages under God's control. The 11th Decretum of Gratian permitted dream interpretation for spiritual guidance, but condemned reliance on them for worldly gain. Yet, monks recorded dreams in monastery chronicles, as seen in the annals of Cluny Abbey, to guide religious life. Dreams carried power, but also risk. You might wake, wondering if your vision warned of betrayal, or if a neighbor's dream of your success hinted at envy. In a world where plague or famine loomed, dreams were both prophecy and peril. But how did these night visions shape daily life, and what tensions arose when their omens went awry? You're now in the bustling square of a 14th century Italian town, where a crowd gathers around a wise woman recounting her dream of a broken bridge, urging the village to avoid travel. Dream omens had woven themselves into the fabric of medieval life, guiding not just individuals, but entire communities, from planting schedules to marriage plans. The 13th century chronicle of Salembene de Autumn recounts a village delaying a harvest after a farmer's dream of locusts, fearing it foretold ruin. Such visions weren't mere stories, they shaped collective action. As communities relied on shared dreams to navigate a world where a single misstep could mean hunger or loss. Interpreting dreams was a communal art in Northern Europe, as noted. In the 14th century records of St. Albans, villagers gathered at dawn to share dreams with a cleric who matched symbols to outcomes using texts like the Somniel Danieli. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 1320s Venetian notarial records, healers burned rosemary before sleep to clarify visions, believing its scent drew truth. Archaeological finds from medieval Krakow reveal clay tablets inscribed with dream symbols used to guide decisions. These rituals, often led by elders or clergy, bound communities, as described in the 12th century writings of John of Salisbury, who noted how shared dreams fostered unity against uncertainty. The Church's stance was nuanced. While condemning pagan oniromancy, clergy often interpreted dreams as divine, as seen in the 11th century Vita Sanctae, which cast visions as God's guidance. Priests might lead prayers to clarify a troubling dream, a practice recorded in the 1290s Annals of Canterbury. In Jewish communities, as noted in the 13th century responsa of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, dreams were analyzed with Talmudic wisdom, guiding ritual timing. In Islamic Spain, influenced by scholars like Ibn Rushd, dreams were studied for medical insights, a custom mentioned in 12th century texts. These cross-cultural practices enriched dream lore as trade routes spread interpretive traditions. Yet, dreams could spark discord. A failed omen crop lost despite a dream of abundance often led to blame. The 14th century court rolls of Florence describe a man shunned after his dream of rain misled farmers. His vision deemed false or cursed. Such tensions targeted the vulnerable dream interpreters, often women or outsiders whose visions were questioned when misfortune struck. The rituals, meant to bring clarity, sometimes deepened mistrust as villagers debated whose dream held truth. But what happened when a dream's prophecy led to open conflict, and how did communities resolve the chaos of a misread vision? Picture yourself in a 14th century village, waking from a dream of a flooding river, only to learn of a neighbor's drowned livestock, the vision now blamed for the loss. Dream omens had become a force that could fracture communities as failed prophecies turned hope into accusation. When a dream misled a marriage soured, despite visions of harmony, villagers often targeted the dreamer or interpreter. The 1360s manorial records of Winchester recount a woman, Agnes, ostracized after her dream of a bountiful harvest preceded a blight, her vision deemed a deception. Such social verdicts, swift and harsh, were common as communities sought to purge the taint of a false omen in a world where survival hung by a thread. Rituals to counter bad dreams were as vital as harvesting crops. You might join a dawn prayer led by a priest burning sage to cleanse a troubling vision, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of York Minster. In Mediterranean towns, as recorded in 1370s Venetian documents, villagers slept near sacred springs to wash away ill omens, believing water purified dreams. Archaeological finds from medieval Prague show dream symbols carved on wooden amulets worn to redirect bad visions. These acts, repetitive yet profound, were acts of resilience, a collective stand against a world of unseen threats. Much like replanting after a storm, the legacy of dream omens was enduring, shaping a culture of vigilance. People guarded sleep with care, avoiding heavy meals to prevent false visions. As noted in the 15th century writings of John Merck, the practice reached trade merchants in Bruges, as seen in 14th century guild records, delayed deals after dreams of loss, blaming failure on ignored omens. By the late Middle Ages, as science questioned mysticism, dream interpretation faded, but left traces in folklore and proverbs. In Jewish and Islamic communities, dreams remained sacred, guiding rituals, a tradition persisting in modern practices. Today, you might jot down a vivid dream, a reflex echoing those medieval visionaries. Dream omens reveal humanity's need to find meaning in the subconscious, much like modern habits of journaling dreams or seeking signs. The medieval villager, recounting a vision to avert doom, was not so different from you, seeking clarity. In uncertainty, their rituals, born of hope and fear, shaped a society that trusted in the night's messages, a legacy that lingers in our fascination with dreams. What other signs, like shadows or talismans, guided their lives, and how do they echo in our instincts today? Shadow omens, the fear of unseen shapes as you walk through a moonlit 13th century German village, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. You freeze as your shadow stretches long across the path, its shape twisting unnaturally in the flickering torchlight. In medieval Europe, shadows were not mere absences of light, but omens, believed to carry warnings of fate or malevolent forces. Rooted in Germanic folklore and Christian mysticism, shadows were seen as extensions of the soul, their distortions signaling divine or demonic interference. The 12th century writings of Hildegard of Bingen describe shadows shifting before misfortune, interpreted as God's signs. In a world where darkness held unseen threats, shadow omens were both guide and dread. Picture yourself as a miller, glancing at your shadow as you lock the mill at dusk. A sudden warp or flicker might foretell illness or betrayal. As noted in the 13th century Liber de Umbres, a text on shadow divination. These beliefs shaped daily life. You'd avoid walking over another's shadow, fearing it could steal vitality, a custom recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Before a journey, you might check your shadow's clarity under moonlight, believing a blurred edge warned of danger. Even mundane tasks, like grinding grain, were timed to avoid casting long shadows, thought to attract spirits, as described in the 12th century herbal texts of Roger Bacon. Shadow rituals were precise. In Northern Europe, as archaeological finds, from Viking-era Yorkshire, villagers carved wooden stakes to pin errant shadows, believing this trapped evil influences. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 12th century Sicilian records, people sprinkled salt where shadows fell to purify them. For children, elders taught caution around twilight, when shadows were strongest, as oral traditions in 13th century Breton ballads attest. In Jewish communities, as noted in the Cairo Geniza, shadows were observed during prayers, their shapes guiding ritual timing. The Church, wary of pagan roots, framed shadows as divine signs under God's control. The 11th century decretum of Gratian permitted observing shadows for spiritual insight, but condemned their use for personal gain. Yet, monks noted shadow patterns in monastery courtyards, as seen in the annals of Cluny Abbey, to schedule tasks. Shadows carried power, but also risk. You might hesitate at dusk, wondering if your shadow's twist warned of doom, or if a neighbor's clear shadow hinted at hidden favor. In a society where survival was precarious, shadows were both prophecy and peril. But how did these omens shape village life, and what tensions arose when their signs were misread? You're now in the heart of a 14th century Spanish market, where a merchant pauses under a torch's glow, wary of his shadow's jagged edge, fearing it foretells a failed trade. Shadow omens had woven themselves into medieval life, guiding not just personal choices, but communal decisions. From sowing crops to settling disputes, the 13th century Chronicle of Salambin de Autumn recounts a village where a distorted shadow, cast during a council meeting, halted a land deal, its shape blamed for impending strife. Such beliefs weren't mere superstition, they shaped collective action, as communities relied on shadows to navigate a world where betrayal or famine loomed. A clear shadow brought trust, a warped one, dread. Shadow rituals were a communal craft. In Northern Europe, as noted in the 14th century records of Durham Priory, villagers gathered at twilight to trace shadows on church walls, believing their alignment predicted harvests. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 1320s Venetian notarial records, people burned olive branches to cleanse shadows, their smoke thought to dispel evil. Archaeological finds from medieval Krakow reveal stone markers placed where shadows fell, etched with crosses to ward off curses. These practices, often led by elders or clergy, bound communities, as described in the 12th century writings of John of Salisbury, who noted how shadow omens fostered unity against unseen threats. The Church's stance was complex. While condemning pagan divination, clergy often saw shadows as divine signs, as seen in the 11th century Physiologus, which linked them to God's judgment. Priests might bless shadowed ground with holy water, a practice recorded in the 1290s Annals of Canterbury. In Jewish communities, as noted in the 13th century responsa of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, shadow shapes guided prayer times, seen as reflections of divine will. In Islamic Spain, influenced by scholars like Ibn Rushd, shadows were studied for their angles, a custom mentioned in 12th century astronomical texts, blending science and mysticism. Yet, shadow omens could spark conflict. A misread shape crop failed, despite a favorable shape often led to blame. The 14th century court rolls of Florence describe a woman shunned after her shadow's twist preceded a neighbor's illness, her presence deemed cursed. Such tensions targeted the vulnerable elders, women, or outsiders whose shadows were scrutinized when misfortune struck. The rituals, meant to bring clarity, sometimes deepened mistrust as villagers debated whose shadow held truth. But what happened when a shadow's omen led to open disputes, and how did communities resolve the chaos of a misread sign? Picture yourself in a 14th century village, standing in a torchlit square as your shadow flickers wildly, blamed for a neighbor's sudden fever. Shadow omens had become a force that could fracture communities, as misread signs turned hope into accusation. When a shadow's prophecy failed a clear shape, preceded a failed harvest, villagers often targeted those whose shadows seemed cursed. The 1360s manorial records of Salisbury recount a man, Thomas, ostracized after his shadow's distortion was blamed for a village fire. His exclusion from communal work, a harsh penalty in a world where cooperation meant survival. Rituals to counter bad shadow omens were as vital as planting crops. You might join a midnight vigil led by a priest, scattering ash where a shadow fell to cleanse its taint, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of York Minster. In Mediterranean towns, as recorded in 1370s Venetian documents, families waved rosemary branches over shadowed ground to dispel evil. Archaeological finds from medieval Prague show wooden stakes carved with prayers driven into earth to fix errant shadows. These acts, repetitive yet profound, were acts of resilience, a collective stand against a world of unseen threats. Much like rebuilding after a flood, the legacy of shadow omens was enduring, shaping a culture of vigilance. People moved cautiously at twilight, avoiding casting long shadows. As noted in the 15th century writings of John Merck, the practice reached trade merchants in Venice, as seen in 14th century guild records, avoided deals under flickering lights, fearing warped shadows signaled loss. By the late Middle Ages, as science challenged mysticism, shadow omens faded but left traces in folklore and proverbs. In Jewish and Islamic communities, shadows remained tied to spiritual timing, a tradition persisting in modern rituals. Today, you might pause at an odd shadow, a reflex echoing those medieval fears. Shadow omens reveal humanity's need to find meaning in the intangible, much like modern habits of avoiding cracks or seeking signs. The medieval villager, watching their shadow to avert doom, was not so different from you, seeking order in uncertainty. Their rituals, born of fear and hope, shaped a society wary of the unseen, a legacy that that lingers in our glances at fleeting shapes? What other beliefs, like those of talismans or omens, guided their lives? And how do they echo in our instincts today? Talisman craft, objects of power and protection. As you stand in a 13th century English village, the air rich with the scent of fresh straw and blooming lavender, you clutch a small iron pendant etched with a cross, its weight a comfort against unseen threats. In medieval Europe, talismans were not mere trinkets, but potent objects, believed to channel divine or mystical power to protect against evil, illness, or misfortune. Rooted in Greco-Roman and Celtic traditions, these crafted items, often metal, stone, or wood, were seen as shields for the soul. The 12th century writings of Hildegard of Bingen describe talismans as conduits of God's grace used to ward off curses or spirits. In a world where danger lurked in every shadow, talismans were essential armor. Picture yourself as a farmer, carving a hazelwood charm under moonlight, believing its potency peaked in lunar glow. As noted in the Anglo-Saxon Lachnunga manuscript, these weren't casual crafts. Talismans required intent. You'd engrave a rune or saint's symbol, perhaps whispering a prayer to Saint Cuthbert, a practice recorded in the 13th century annals of Durham Priory. Materials were precious iron for strength, amber for lecophon, sourced from local smiths, or traders, as seen in the Doomsday Book. A talisman might be worn, buried under a threshold, or hung in a barn to protect livestock. Its creation a blend of skill and faith. Rituals varied by region. In Mediterranean villages, as 12th century Sicilian records show, people crafted shell talismans, polished and blessed to guard against the evil eye. In Northern Europe, archaeological finds from Viking-era York reveal bone amulets etched with Thor's hammer, used for safe travels. For children, mothers tied tiny charms to cradles, a custom noted in 13th century Breton ballads. In Jewish communities, as recorded in the Cairo Genesa, talismans bore Hebrew inscriptions paired with psalms for protection. Islamic talismans, influenced by trade, often used inscribed gems. As mentioned in the 12th century works of Ibn al-Hathum, the Church, cautious of pagan roots, often blessed talismans to align them with Christian faith. The 11th century benedictional of St. Theobald includes prayers for consecrating charms, merging old beliefs with new. Yet, talismans could spark suspicion. You might eye a neighbor's pendant, wondering if it shielded or cursed. In a society where a failed crop could mean starvation, talismans were both hope and hazard. But how did these crafted objects shape village life? And what tensions arose when their power was questioned? You're now in the lively market of a 14th century French town, where a trader fingers a carved stone talisman, hesitating to sell it after hearing of its maker's sudden illness. Talismans were more than personal charms. They were communal anchors, binding villages through shared rituals, but also sowing distrust when their power faltered. The 13th century chronicle of Salimbanda Adam recounts a village where a talisman, meant to protect a harvest, was blamed for a blight, sparking accusations of witchcraft against its crafter. Such incidents show how talismans, intended to shield, could become sources of fear in a world quick to assign blame. Crafting talismans was a revered skill in Northern Europe, as noted in the 14th century records of St. Albans. Villagers etched oak charms at dawn, believing the rising sun infused them with strength. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 1320s Venetian notarial records, artisans polished coral talismans, their red hue thought to repel curses. Archaeological finds from medieval Krakow reveal iron pendants buried under hearths, inscribed with crosses to safeguard homes. These rituals, often communal, involved prayers or chants, as described in the 12th century writings of John of Salisbury, who noted their role in uniting villages against misfortune. The church played a dual role. While condemning pagan craftsmanship, clergy often sanctified talismans, as seen in the 11th century ritual ramenum, which included blessings for protective objects. Priests might anoint charms with holy oil, a practice recorded in the 1290s Annals of Canterbury. In Jewish communities, as noted in the 13th century responsa of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, talismans were inscribed with Torah verses for protection. In Islamic Spain, influenced by trade, talismans of engraved onyx were paired with prayers, a custom mentioned in the 12th century works of Ibn al-Haytham. These cross-cultural practices enriched talisman lore as merchants spread techniques along trade routes. Yet, talismans could breed discord. A failed charm a sick child, despite a pendant's promise, often led to accusations of malice. The 14th century court rolls of Norwich describe a woman shunned after her talisman failed to save a neighbor's crop. Her skill questioned despite her efforts. Such tensions targeted the vulnerable artisans, women, or outsiders whose crafts were scrutinized when misfortune struck. The rituals, meant to foster safety, sometimes deepened mistrust as villagers debated whose talisman held true power. But what happened when a talisman's failure led to open conflict? And how did communities resolve the tension between faith and fear? Picture yourself in a 14th century village, standing by a flickering fire as a neighbor's bone talisman, blamed for a barren harvest, is cast into the flames. Talismans had become more than protective charms. They were forces that could fracture communities when their power failed. When a talisman faltered, a child fell ill, a journey ended in ruins. Suspicion often fell on its maker. The 1360s manorial records of Winchester recount a case where a man, Robert, was accused of crafting a cursed amulet after his pendant preceded a neighbor's livestock deaths. His exclusion from the village market, a harsh penalty in a world where community was survival. Rituals to cleanse failed talismans were as vital as sowing fields. You might join villagers in a dawn ceremony, burying a suspect charm under church steps with prayers to Saint Hildegard, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of York Minster. In Mediterranean towns, as recorded in 1370s Sicilian documents, families burned failed talismans with sage, believing the smoke lifted curses. Archaeological finds from medieval Prague show wooden charms, recarved with crosses, hung in homes to restore their power. These acts, repetitive yet profound, were acts of resilience, a collective stand against a world of sudden losses. Much like mending a torn net to catch fish, the legacy of talisman craft was enduring, shaping a culture of cautious faith. People crafted charms with precision, avoiding certain days. As noted in the 15th century writings of John Merck, who described villagers' fear of angering spirits. The practice reached trade merchants in Venice, as seen in 14th century guild records, carried talismans for safe deals, blaming failures on faulty charms. By the late Middle Ages, as science questioned mysticism, talismans faded but left traces in jewelry and relics. In Jewish and Islamic communities, inscribed charms remained sacred, used in rituals that persist in modern blessings. Today, you might wear a lucky pendant or carry a charm, a reflex, echoing those medieval crafters. Talisman craft reveals humanity's need to harness protection from the unknown, much like modern habits of wearing crosses or lucky coins. The medieval villager, carving a charm to avert doom, was not so different from you, seeking safety in uncertainty. Their rituals, born of fear and hope, shaped a society that trusted in crafted power, a legacy that lingers in our adornments and beliefs. What other practices, like omens or blessings, guided their lives, and how do they echo in our instincts? Today, blessed relics, sacred objects of divine favor, as you kneel in a 13th century English chapel, the air thick with incense and the glow of candlelight. You touch a tiny bone fragment encased in a silver reliquary, believed to be from St. Cuthbert's finger. In medieval Europe, relics, bones, cloth, or objects tied to saints were not mere keepsakes, but sacred conduits of divine power, thought to heal, protect, or bring miracles. Rooted in early Christian traditions and amplified by pilgrimage culture, relics were revered as God's presence on earth. The 12th century writings of Bernard of Clairvaux describe relics as channels of grace, drawing crowds to shrines for blessings. In a world of plague and peril, relics were anchors of hope. Picture yourself as a pilgrim, traveling miles to touch a relic, perhaps a splinter of the true cross, as recorded in the 13th century annals of Durham Priory. These weren't casual visits. Relics shaped lives. A farmer might pray over a saint's tooth for a bountiful harvest, while a mother sought a saint's cloth for a sick child, practices noted in the 12th century Vita Sanctae. Relics were often housed in ornate reliquaries, crafted from gold or ivory, as archaeological finds from Canterbury show. Their power was communal. Villages shared access to relics, their presence a shield against calamity. Rituals varied by region. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 12th century Sicilian records, relics like St. Agatha's veil were carried in processions to ward off storms. In Northern Europe, as noted in Viking era York, finds bone relics were sewn into pouches for personal protection. For children, elders taught reverence for relics, as 13th century Breton ballads attest. In Jewish communities, while relics were less common, sacred texts served similar roles, as noted in the Cairo, Genisa. Islamic communities, influenced by trade, venerated relics like the Prophet's cloak, as mentioned in 12th century texts by Ibn al-Haytham. The Church tightly controlled relics, blessing them to ensure authenticity, as seen in the 11th century ritual Ramah. Yet, their power sparked unease. You might wonder if a rival's relic outshone yours, or if a miracle's failure signaled divine disfavor. In a society where faith was survival, relics were both salvation and scrutiny. But how did these sacred objects shape community life, and what tensions arose when their miracles failed to manifest? You're now in the crowded square of a 14th century Italian city, where pilgrims line up to kiss a reliquary, holding a fragment of St. Mark's robe, hoping for protection from plague. Relics were more than sacred objects. They were communal touchstones, uniting villages through shared devotion, but also sparking suspicion when their power faltered. The 13th century chronicle of Salimbian de Adam recounts a town where a relic, meant to heal a sick child, failed, leading to whispers that its keeper had mishandled its sanctity. Such incidents show how relics, intended to bind communities, could become sources of doubt in a world where faith and survival were intertwined. Relic rituals were a sacred art in Northern Europe, as noted in the 14th century records of St. Albans. Villagers joined processions to carry relics around fields, believing their presence ensured fertile soil. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 1320s Venetian notarial records, relics were dipped in holy water to amplify their power, a ritual thought to ward off curses. Archaeological finds from medieval Krakow reveal silver reliquaries etched with prayers placed under church altars for communal blessings. These practices, often led by clergy, strengthened community bonds, as described in the 12th century writings of John of Salisbury, who noted relics' role in uniting villages against misfortune. The church's role was central but complex. While promoting relics as divine, it guarded against fraud, as seen in the 11th century Decretum of Gratian, which demanded authentication. Priests blessed relics with incense, a practice recorded in the 1290s Annals of Canterbury. In Jewish communities, as noted in the 13th century Responsa of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, sacred scrolls served as quasi-relics, blessed for protection. In Islamic Spain, relics like the Prophet's sandal were venerated, as mentioned in 12th century texts by Ibn al-Haytham, blending local and trade-influenced traditions. These cross-cultural practices enriched relic worship as pilgrims spread devotion along routes. Yet, relics could breed discord. A failed miracle crop, lost despite a relic's blessing, often led to accusations of mishandling or divine wrath. The 14th century court rolls of Florence describe a monk shunned after a relic failed to heal, his stewardship questioned. Such tensions targeted the vulnerable keepers, pilgrims, or outsiders whose relics were scrutinized. When misfortune struck, the rituals, meant to foster faith, sometimes deepened mistrust, as villagers debated whose relic held true power. But what happened when a relic's failure sparked open conflict? And how did communities resolve the tension between devotion and doubt? Picture yourself in a 14th century village, standing before a church altar where a relic of St. Anne's veil, blamed for a failed harvest, is now locked away, its failure stirring anger among the faithful. Relics had become more than sacred objects. They were forces that could fracture communities when their miracles faltered. When a relic disappointed a child died despite prayers, a storm struck despite devotion, suspicion often fell on its keeper or the community's faith. The 1360s manorial records of Winchester recount a case where a priest accused of mishandling a relic after a village illness was barred from services. Bound society. Rituals to restore a relic's favor were as vital as planting crops. You might join a midnight procession led by clergy, reconsecrating a relic with holy oil, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of York Minster. In Mediterranean towns, as recorded in 1370s Venetian documents, failed relics were re-blessed with incense under a full moon to renew their power. Archaeological finds from medieval Prague show reliquaries etched with new prayers, buried briefly to cleanse their taint. These acts, repetitive yet profound, were acts of resilience, a collective stand against a world of sudden calamities. Much like rebuilding after a flood, the legacy of relics was enduring, shaping a culture of fervent devotion. People revered relics with care, timing pilgrimages to sacred days. As noted in the 15th century writings of John Merck, the practice reached trade merchants in Bruges. As seen in 14th century guild records, carried relic fragments for safe journeys, blaming losses on neglected devotion. By the late Middle Ages, as Reformation ideas challenged relic worship, their influence waned but left traces in icons and heirlooms. In Jewish and Islamic communities, sacred objects like scrolls or relics of prophets remained revered, a tradition persisting in modern rituals. Today, you might touch a family heirloom for luck, a reflex echoing those medieval pilgrims. Relics reveal humanity's need to connect with the divine, much like modern habits of wearing crosses or visiting shrines. The medieval villager praying before a saint's bone was not so different from you, seeking favor in uncertainty. Their rituals, born of faith and fear, shaped a society that trusted in sacred power, a legacy that lingers in our reverence for holy objects. What other beliefs, like omens or charms, guided their lives, and how do they echo in our instincts today? Whether omens, reading the sky for survivals, you stand in a windswept 13th century Scottish field, the air sharp with the scent of damp grass and approaching rain. You scan the horizon for signs of a brewing storm, noting the crimson hue of the dawn sky. In medieval Europe, whether omens were not mere folklore but vital tools, believed to reveal nature's intentions through clouds, winds, or animal behaviors. Rooted in Celtic and Norse traditions, these signs were seen as divine messages, guiding survival in a world where a single tempest could destroy a harvest. The 12th century writings of Gerald of Wales describe villagers reading wind shifts to predict drought, blending observation with faith. In an era of unpredictable seasons, whether omens were life itself, picture yourself as a farmer, watching a ring around the moon, a sign of rain foretold in the 13th century Liber Meteororum. These omens weren't guesses, they shaped decisions. A red sunset might prompt you to hurry the harvest, while circling birds warned of frost, as noted in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Before sowing, you'd study cloud patterns, believing their shapes signaled divine favor, a practice recorded in the 12th century herbal texts of Roger Bacon. Every sign mattered. Misreading the sky could mean starvation in a society where food was scarce, whether rituals were meticulous. In Northern Europe, as archaeological finds from Viking era York show, villagers hung wind chimes carved with runes to read breezes, believing their tones predicted storms. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 12th century Sicilian records, people scattered salt on fields to appease sky spirits. For children, elders taught cloud watching, as 13th century Breton ballads attest. In Jewish communities, as noted in the Cairo Genessa, weather signs guided prayer times, with psalms recited for rain. Islamic traditions, influenced by trade, used wind patterns for navigation, as mentioned in 12th century texts by Ibn al-Haytham. The Church, wary of pagan roots, framed weather omens as God's signs. The 11th century decretum of Gratian allowed their use for farming but condemned divination for personal gain. Yet monks tracked clouds, as seen in the annals of Cluny Abbey, to schedule planting. Weather omens carried hope, but also fear you might hesitate to sow, wondering if a neighbor's storm prediction outdid yours. In a world where famine loomed, the sky was both guide and judge. But how did these omens shape daily life, and what tensions arose when the sky's signs failed? You're now in the bustling heart of a 14th century Venetian port, where a sailor studies the sky's streaked clouds, delaying a voyage after spotting a storm omen. Weather omens had woven themselves into medieval life, guiding not just farmers, but merchants, sailors, and healers, in a world where nature's whims could ruin livelihoods. The 13th century chronicle of Salimbene de Autumn recounts a village halting a market day after a red dawn, fearing it foretold flood. These signs weren't mere guesses, they shaped collective decisions. As communities relied on the sky to navigate uncertainty, from trade routes to harvest timing. Reading the sky was a communal skill. In Northern Europe, as noted in the 14th century records of Durham Priory, villagers gathered at dusk to interpret cloud shapes, believing wispy streaks signaled drought. In Mediterranean regions, as seen in 1320s Venetian notarial records, sailors watched gull flights, their patterns thought to predict winds. Archaeological finds from medieval Krakow reveal wooden staffs carved with cloud symbols used to guide planting. These rituals, often led by elders or clergy, bound communities, as described in the 12th century writings of John of Salisbury, who noted how weather omens fostered unity against nature's caprices. The Church's stance was nuanced. While condemning pagan divination, it saw weather signs as divine, as noted in the 11th century Physiologus, which linked clouds to God's will. Priests led prayers for rain after ominous skies, a practice recorded in the 1290s Annals of Canterbury. In Jewish communities, as noted in the 13th century responsa of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, weather omens guided festival timing, with prayers for rain tied to cloud patterns. In Islamic Spain, influenced by scholars like Ibn Rushd, wind shifts were studied for navigation, as mentioned in 12th century texts. These cross-cultural practices enriched weather lore as trade routes spread knowledge. Yet, weather omens could spark conflict. A failed prediction of drought, despite a cloud's promise, often led to blame. The 14th century court rolls of Norwich describe a wise woman shunned after her wind omen misled farmers, her foresight deemed false. Such tensions targeted the vulnerable elders, women, or outsiders whose readings were questioned when misfortune struck. The rituals, meant to bring clarity, sometimes deepened mistrust, as villagers debated whose sky reading held truth. But what happened when a weather omen's failure led to open disputes? And how did communities resolve the chaos of a misread sky? Picture yourself in a 14th century village, standing in a rain-soaked field, as a neighbor blames your cloud omen for a flooded harvest, the sky's betrayal sparking anger. Weather omens had become a force that could fracture communities, as failed predictions turned hope into accusation. When the sky mislead, a frost struck despite a warm winds, promise villagers often targeted those who read the signs. The 1360s manorial records of Winchester recount a case where a man, Thomas, was shunned after his sunset omen failed, blamed for a ruined crop. His exclusion from communal work, a harsh penalty in a world where cooperation was survival. Rituals, to appease the sky, were as vital as sowing seeds. You might join a twilight prayer led by a priest, scattering ash to calm stormy omens, a practice noted in the 14th century annals of York Minster. In Mediterranean towns, as recorded in 1370s Venetian documents, villagers offered bread to rivers after false rain signs, believing it restored balance. Archaeological finds from medieval Prague show wooden carvings of clouds buried to redirect bad omens. These acts, repetitive yet profound, were acts of resilience, a collective stand against nature's whims, much like rebuilding after a storm. The legacy of weather omens was enduring, shaping a culture of vigilance. People watched skies with care, avoiding sowing on days of ill omens. As noted in the 15th century writings of John Merck, the practice reached trade merchants in Venice. As seen in 14th century guild records, delayed voyages after storm signs, blaming losses on ignored skies. By the late Middle Ages, as science like Copernicus theories emerged, weather omens faded but left traces in almanacs and proverbs. In Jewish and Islamic communities, sky signs guided rituals, a tradition persisting in modern weather lore today. You might check a forecast or note a red sky, a reflex echoing those medieval sky watchers. Weather omens reveal humanity's need to predict the unpredictable, much like modern habits of checking apps or heeding old sayings. The medieval villager, reading clouds to avert ruin, was not so different from you, seeking control in uncertainty. Their rituals, born of necessity and faith, shaped a society that trusted the sky's signals, a legacy that lingers in our glances at the heavens. What other signs, like plants or animals, guided their lives, and how do they echo in our instincts today?